Have you ever found yourself staring at your portfolio and wondering, is this really going to impress anyone? You've spent months putting in the work, grinding through YouTube videos, building projects, and learning new technologies. Your GitHub is a battlefield of half-finished projects, but for some reason, you still can't seem to land the interviews or clients you deserve. What if the problem isn't your skills, but the way you're showcasing them? You've spent so much time building projects for others that you forgot to invest in the most important project of all, yourself, your story, your portfolio. In a world where your portfolio is your first impression, a boring page is more than just a missed opportunity. It's like putting a brick wall in between yourself and the jobs and opportunities you deserve. Here's the brutal reality. When someone lands on your portfolio, they're not just looking at your projects. They're judging your creativity, your attention to detail, and your ability to bring designs to life. It's not just a showcase of your work, it's your digital first impression. And in today's competitive market, that first impression can be the difference between putting a spotlight on your work or turning off the lights altogether. Now imagine if you had a different portfolio than the one you have now, one that doesn't just list your skills, but tells your unique story, where each section is carefully crafted to tell a narrative that showcases not just what you can build, but how you think, how you solve problems, and why you're the best person for the job. A portfolio so good, it would make anyone want to work with you. You've probably seen these portfolios before. Today, you'll build one. So are you ready to stop putting off your portfolio and start building something you're proud to share? If so, let's dive in and create something amazing together. Now, before we dive in, let me show you what we'll be building. In the Hero section, a beautiful intro animation welcomes users to the site. If you click the mobile navigation, we animate the drop-down menu onto the page, and hovering these nav items is interactive and engaging. Once we close that up, scrolling further down the page reveals a one-of-a-kind animation that will showcase your creativity. Down in the intro section, the words gracefully animate onto the page, giving this section polish and focusing attention on the content. Down in the projects section, hovering over each project reveals a preview of the project in a fun and interactive way. Even the hover effects are animated and interactive. As we scroll down to the testimonials section, you'll notice dual titles animating in opposite directions, giving this section a sense of depth and polish. And as we navigate through the testimonials, we see a beautiful quote reveal animation. Not only will users focus on what the testimonials say, but the polish of the animation will highlight your attention to detail. Even the FAQs section has graceful hover effects and smooth, buttery animations, delighting users and keeping them engaged with this section and with the page. And we didn't even settle for a boring footer. That's not the front-end tribe way. Instead, we animated every element in this footer, giving your notification a subtle pulse, animating our title text onto the page, and even giving our button icon a crisp flip animation when hovered. Overall, this portfolio is a next-level project that you'll be proud to share with the world. Before we jump in, I want to make sure you have everything you need to succeed. I've created a comprehensive starter bundle for this project, and yes, it's completely free. This bundle includes all the essentials you'll need: a pre-configured starter template, professional designs, optimized images, and every icon used in this project. This way, you can focus on learning and building without getting stuck on setup or hunting down assets. You'll find the download link for this free bundle in the description below. Now, this is part 2 of this project, so if you haven't watched part 1 yet, I've dropped the link in the description below. Enough talk, let's build. Coming back to our design, let's go ahead and move down to the footer. So you can see that we have this nice title here in the center, along with this email button with this icon arrow up to the right. And then we also have this notification, one spot available for next month, along with our navigation and a nice little copyright here at the bottom. So this is not going to be anything overly complex, but certainly enough to dig into and enough to add nice animated effects into as well. Over in the tablet view, you can see that we move our navigation to the right and make our title for the footer a little bit bigger. And then over in the desktop view, of course, you're going to get the full effect of this nice large title that we're going to animate onto the screen, as well as our navigation staying on the right. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the code. Coming back into our code, let's go ahead and find our footer section. So I'm going to come into my sections directory. You can see we have this footer.tsx here. So we can come into our app directory, into our page, and go ahead and import our footer. So I'm going to import footer from @section/footer, and let's just drop it into the end of our page by going ahead and dropping it after our FAQs section. After that, we should hopefully see the word footer down at the bottom of our coded template, which we do. So I'm going to close out page, go into my footer section, and start writing our code here. I'm going to replace this div with a semantic footer tag. Of course, we are going to have our container inside of here. So I'm going to say div class name equals container. And then inside of our container, we're going to go ahead and put our notification. So that's going to be in a div at the top. That's going to say one spot available for next month. After that div, we are going to have our title. So that's going to be inside of an H2. And that is going to say enough talk. Let's make something great together. And then below that, we know we're going to have a button. So we'll go ahead for now and just put a placeholder button there, although we can bring in our button component here in a second. And we know that that button text is going to be info@alextaylor.com. And we are going to have an icon there as well, but we're not going to worry about that quite yet. Below that, we're going to have our navigation. So we'll say nav, and then for each of those items, we'll go ahead and loop over those, probably by going ahead and creating an array. Now, I usually include an array here, but I didn't include one for this one. So I'm going to say const nav items equals an array. And for each of those items, we want to have an href and a label. So that we're going to have href and label. And for now, the href is just going to be a hash, but we can come back and fill those in later as well. So I'm just going to copy and paste that 5 times because we have 5 different nav items. And then for our first label, we'll have home. The second one will be projects. The third will be testimonials. The fourth will be FAQs. And the fifth will be contact. After we have those nav items, we can come down into our navigation and go ahead and loop over those by saying nav items.map. And then for each of those items, we'll go ahead and say that the href and label are going to be what we're going to pull out, and we're going to return some JSX for each of those. The tag that we're going to use is a link tag, of course, and we're going to have our href be filled in with that. We're also going to have the interior of that be the label, and then we also want a key. So we'll say key equals label as well, and that will go ahead and keep React happy as we're looping over those navigation items. After that, the last part that we need is a paragraph for our copyright. So we'll go ahead and create a paragraph at the bottom, and that's going to be copyright. And then we'll use the copy symbol. So we'll say and copy with a semicolon, Alex Taylor. And then we'll also use the bullet symbol. So that's and bull with a semicolon, all rights reserved. Now that we're done adding our content to our page, let's go ahead and start styling this content up. So first of all, the footer is going to have a background color that's going to be a lot darker. So we're going to say class name on our footer tag of BG Stone 900. And for now, the text is going to be white. We also do want to add padding top and bottom, but this padding is going to be a little bit different because we're going to be surrounding the content of our footer with that section-like padding, but the very bottom of it, we're also going to have some additional padding for it as well. So this is going to be a little bit different. We are going to want to go ahead and separate these out. We're going to have a div here that's going to wrap most of our content in this footer. We're going to add a class name of section to that div to add the top and bottom padding for that. But then we're going to also have this paragraph down here that we're going to add some top and bottom padding to as well. So we'll say class name equals, and we can say PY16, and that should add the right top and bottom padding to that copyright down there as well. Let me go ahead and pull out my browser just so we can get a little bit better look at the design next to what we have in our code, and go ahead and put away my sidebar for now, and then we'll continue styling this up. For the one spot available, let's go ahead and wrap that in a span tag because we want to have another element that we can use for our pulsing circle. So we'll also give another div element in here, and we'll go ahead and give that a class name of size 3 to make that 12 by 12, rounded full. We'll give it a background of BG green 400. And for now, that hopefully should make it the right size. And for our entire div, we'll give it a class name of flex. We'll say items center gap 3 and go ahead and save that. And down in our span tag, we want to make sure our text is uppercase. So we'll say class name equals uppercase and see if that makes everything look like the design. It's looking good so far. Let's move down to our title. We want to give this the right font size. So we'll say class name equals text 4XL to give that the right font size. We also want to move that down a bit. So we'll say MT8 to move that down by 32 pixels from our notification there on the top of the footer. And this text is a little bit thinner, even though it looks like the rest of the text in the design, it is a little bit thinner. So we'll need to add a font weight here as well. So we'll say font extra light to go ahead and add that lighter font weight to it and just make it a little bit thinner. For our button, there's a couple of things we'll want to do here, but of course we're going to want to bring in the component we've already created. So I'm going to come up to the top of my component and say import button from @/component/button, and then we'll replace our button with that component instead. So we have a button here. We're going to need to give it a variant. So the variant is going to be secondary. And we also want to say that we have an icon after it. So icon after, and that's going to be equal to some JSX. Of course, we need to import that as well, or at least copy and paste that. So I'm going to go back to my files, find my arrow up right icon. So I'm going to into my icons and look for arrow up right. And then we can copy and paste this arrow into our footer. So let's go ahead and do that. And then of course, we'll need to change it over to valid JSX. So I'm going to change class to class name. I'm going to change stroke width like so. And I'm going to change my stroke line cap and line join to camel case attributes. After we have that in place, we also need to slide this down a bit. So I'm also going to give this a class name as well. And we'll say MT8 to move that down by 32 pixels from our title. Let's see if that aligns. It's looking like it's aligning well so far. So let's continue on with our navigation. Down in our nav, let's go ahead and give that a class name for our wrapper. And we'll go ahead and make this flexed column. So flex call, and then gap 8 should spread those out by 32 pixels. We also want to move these down by a bit. So we'll say MT16 to give those 64 pixels of top margin. And of course, we want to make all of these uppercase, but it looks like these are actually text buttons that we're using here. So we can use our button component inside of our link to go ahead and give those the right style. So I'm going to say button here, using our button component, wrap the label text in that button, and then I'm going to give it a variant of text, and that should hopefully change our buttons to the right size. And it looks like the only difference between our buttons, our text buttons, and what we're seeing here in this navigation is the text is a little bit bigger. So we're also going to add a class name to each of these buttons and make sure that the text is large for those buttons. That all looks like it's looking good so far. So let's go ahead and scroll down to our copyright, and we'll make sure that is styled up properly as well. So this is this paragraph here. We're going to go ahead and switch the text color. So we'll say text white /30, and that should lighten up that color quite a bit, give it 30% opacity. And we'll also say text small to adjust that font size down just a little bit. After that, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image to see if there's anything that's out of alignment. So I'm looking at my reference versus my design, and it looks like everything is in place, which means we can now move on to our other responsive views for our footer. Moving over to our tablet view, these text sizes are going to change a bit. Let me go ahead and see if we have everything working over here. It looks like we do. Let's go ahead and pull out the browser a little bit so we can see our text versus our design. And I'll also go ahead and put away my sidebar for now to give our code a little bit more room as well. So you can see that we are going to move our navigation over to the right at this point, which means we'll need to either move those into a flexed container or a grid. And then we're also going to make our text quite a bit bigger, but I think everything else pretty much stays the same size. So we'll take care of both of those in our coded page. Let's first take care of the text size. Let's come back to our H2 and go ahead and give that a medium modifier and say text 7XL, I believe is the right font size. And that hopefully should make that look like the right size. It looks like it is, but of course we still need to move our navigation next to our title. In order to do that, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and code fold this H2 as well as our button, because both of those are going to go inside of one side of our grid, and then our navigation is going to go in the other side. So we'll go ahead and add a div around all of those. And then we also want to add a div around what we're splitting up. So this is going to be one div that's going to surround our H2 and our button. And then the other div is going to surround our navigation. And this will allow us to go ahead and add a grid class here. So we'll say grid calls 3. And in fact, that's actually going to be at the medium size. So let me go ahead and add a medium modifier to that. And then for our first div, we'll just say class name equals medium call span 2. And that should ensure that this takes up 2 of those columns. And then this div down here takes up 1. So let me go ahead and save that and see how it looks. And it looks like it's getting pretty close. The only difference is we are going to have to move our navigation over and make sure it aligns to the end of that grid column. That should be as easy as adjusting some of our flex classes right here. So we'll say at the medium size, we'll say items end, and that should put our buttons over to the right side of our footer at this size. It looks like we're pretty close to our designs. Let's go ahead and overlay our design real quick and see if there are any differences that we need to take care of. Let me go ahead and give this a quick scroll up and down so we can see. And I do see that we have some misalignment over here in our navigation. And that looks like it's due to a problem that was similar to a problem we had before, where we had some margin that made things look like they were properly aligned, but they actually weren't. So in the medium size, we actually want to switch this to MT0. So I'm going to say medium MT0, which is actually going to pull our navigation up. Let me go ahead and pull our reference image back out to side by side so we can see what's going on. So this is going to pull our navigation up to the top of this grid, but that will allow us to then align the items to the center for the grid. So I'm going to say medium items center, and that will push our navigation there right to the center. And then when we overlay our reference image again, then we get it in the right place. And that's not very much of a difference, but enough of a difference to definitely notice. With that, it looks like our tablet view is correct. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my reference image back out and go over to my desktop view and see what we need to do over here. Over in my desktop view, you can definitely see that the text is a little bit smaller than it is over in the design. We'll definitely have to account for that, but I think that's pretty much what we'll have to account for. So let's go ahead back over to our code and see if there's anything else we'll need to do over here. In our code, let's go into our H2 and say large text 8XL to move our font size up to the right size. And then as we scroll down, we should be able to come over and see if everything is aligned. And it looks like it is, but of course the only way to check is to go ahead and overlay our reference image once again. So when I do that, it looks like everything is perfectly aligned. I'm not seeing any differences, no blurriness. That is all looking great, which means our footer should be good. Let me go ahead and pull my browser window all the way out so we can get a good look and make sure we didn't miss anything across any of our responsive views. But everything right now looks like it's looking perfect, which means we're done with our footer. It's time to start on our animations. So let me go ahead and take my reference image. I'm actually going to reset all of my reference images so that we can focus on our animations from here on out. So we're not going to need these for reference anymore because of course we already created our code to match those static images, but now we're going to be creating dynamic pages. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Let's come back up here and see what we're going to do for our header and our mobile navigation. In order to get started with our header animations, let's head into our source directory, go into our sections folder and find our header.tsx file. Now you can see this is still a static section, and there are a couple of things that we're going to want to change. Some of them are going to be as simple as adding some different CSS properties, and some of them are going to require some more heavy JavaScript animations to make them work. One of the things that we want to do, though, that is just we're going to require some CSS, is we'd like to change the color of this logo as it scrolls over different sections. So as you can see, our logo kind of disappears as we scroll over darker sections. We would like to keep it light instead of having it disappear over those darker sections, but on the lighter sections, we want it to stay dark. One of the things that we can use for this is called mix blend difference, where it takes the color that you currently have and mixes it and makes it opposite what you have in your background. Now we can apply this to our header by saying mix blend difference, and go ahead and hit save. But what you're going to notice is that we have a couple of problems then. One of the issues is that our logo is now too light, so we need to switch the color of that logo. So we can say text white, and that should make sure that it's dark on these lighter backgrounds as well as being light on the darker backgrounds. Now that's exactly what we want for our logo, but that's not necessarily what we want for the rest of our header. So you can see as we pull this out a little bit, now we have some weird effects going on with our button, and we have some weird effects going on with our mobile nav icon. We really only want this to apply to our Alex Taylor text. So in order to get that to work, we need to split these out into a couple of separate divs to get this to function. Now, one of the things I'm going to do as we start to look at this, I'm going to go ahead and pull my zoom up so we can see this full size. And that should help us to be able to see some of these animations better as well. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to essentially want to break this out into two separate layers. One layer is going to hold our logo and it's going to be mix blend difference. The other layer is going to hold our mobile navigation and our button, and it's not going to be mix blend difference. So in order to do that, let me go ahead and code fold my header, and I'm going to go ahead and create those two separate divs that we're going to have as our two separate layers. These layers are both going to be fixed positions. So I'm going to say class name equals, and we're going to basically apply these same classes. So I'm going to say fixed top 0, left 0, width full, all of that's going to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that into my internal layer here. And the same thing is going to be true of this second layer, class name equals, and I'm going to say the same thing, fixed top 0, left 0, width full. And so we can take this off of our header here. Since we only want to apply this mix blend to one of those layers, and that layer is actually going to be the one that's going to be the bottom layer, I'm going to go ahead and take this and put this on this bottom layer. So we're going to have our mix blend difference only being applied to the lower layer, and then this upper layer is going to not have mix blend applied to it. And the same thing's going to be true of the backdrop. We're not going to be applying this to both. So I'm going to take this out and put this on my bottom layer. Now that I've done that, we then need to come into our container and figure out how we're going to put this content into two separate fixed divs instead of just one. So I am going to basically take what we have from container down through our logo and put this inside of this fixed div right here. So I'm going to hit paste and then go ahead and add the couple of ending divs that it's missing. So I think it's missing 2 ending divs. So I'm going to go ahead and make that update. And then I'm going to remove my logo from in here because that won't be on that layer anymore. And let me go ahead and hit save and see what changes. So now it looks like I am seeing my logo, and it looks like it probably is being blended correctly. So yeah, that looks like it's right. But now I'm not seeing any of my other items, and we definitely want to see those inside of this second layer. So let me go ahead and take this container that we have, cut and paste it into my second layer, and go ahead and hit save and see if we now see our content inside of that second fixed div. And we do. It just has a major issue, that being that they were both now aligned to the left instead of one being aligned to the left and one being aligned to the right. So instead of flex justify between on this second layer, what I'd probably like to say is justify end. That should push my content over to the right-hand side instead of being on the left. So let's see how that looks. Let me go ahead and scroll down now that we have those in place and see if everything still looks like it should. It certainly does for the mobile view. It definitely looks like it is aligned properly. So I'm going to take this class name, this unneeded class name, off of my header and just go ahead for 1 second and just kind of chat about what this is actually doing. So if I hide this first one, let me go ahead and just put a hidden class on this bottom div. You can see that that was the layer that included my logo and the backdrop blur. And if we bring that back in and then hide the second one, you can see that that layer then was the one that included my mobile navigation button as well as my contact me button. So those are both inside of that. But basically by splitting those out, we're able to blend one of them with the background differently than we blend the other one. And they're both basically just layering on top of each other so that they look like they're together, but they're actually separate layers. Now that goes a long way to helping us to have a header that works well, but of course we haven't added any animations to this header yet, and we want to do that. So one of the things we'd like to do is we'd like to animate our mobile nav and actually have it open a mobile nav. So in order to do that, we need to go ahead and save some state as to whether a mobile nav is open. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to say const is open, set is open, and we're going to make that equal to use state from React with a default value of false, because of course the mobile nav won't be open at first. When I save this, I'm probably going to see an error, as you can see, because it says that you're importing a component that needs use state and it only works in a client component. So we're going to have to come to the top of our header and go ahead and give this the use client directive. In Next.js, we have to set this client boundary in order to be able to use state the way that we have. After we've done that, let's talk about what we actually want to happen inside of our SVG. So you can see we have this SVG and we actually have two rectangles that represent these two bars. And the first one starts on a Y value of 15. The second one actually starts on a Y value of 7. So these are actually reversed. This is actually the top bar. This is actually the bottom bar. So I'm going to switch these around just to reduce a little bit of confusion here. I'm going to switch my top bar on top of my bottom bar, but you can see if I pull these out, so if I comment these out and hit save, that removes the top bar. And then if I do the same thing with my bottom bar and hit save, you can see that removes the bottom bar. So these are the different bars that are inside of our SVG. What we'd like to do is we'd like to move these first together, and then we'd like to rotate them by 45 and negative 45 degrees to turn them into an X just in this nice smooth animation. So let's actually see if we can do that using style. I'm going to say style equals, and then we'll say transform, translate Y, and we're going to just move this down by 4 pixels since this is the top bar. And let's see if that happens. And it does look like we can do that. And then the same thing, what we'd like to do for our second rectangle is go ahead and add some style to this and say transform, translate Y negative 4 pixels, not negative 40, but negative 4 pixels to move that up to a single line. So you can see that that is the first transformation that we'd like to do. And then the second one is going to be the rotation. So we're going to take the first one and we're going to want to say rotate by 45 degrees. And the second one, we're going to want to rotate by negative 45 degrees. So I'm going to say rotate on this one, negative 45 degrees, and go ahead and hit save. Now you can see that those are rotated, but the origin on those rotations is so out of whack that it's definitely not turning into an X. It's just kind of flying the lines all over the place. That's certainly not what we want. So let's change our transform origin. Let's say transform origin. And we'd like the origin of that transformation for our rotation to be exactly the center of the bar. Now we can calculate where that center is because we know that the icon itself is 24 by 24. So on the x-axis, the center of that is going to be 12 pixels. So I can just say 12 pixels as the x-axis transform origin. And then the y value is going to be basically, since we have a height of 2, each of these bars are 2 pixels tall, and the y value starts at 7, the center of that is going to be 7 plus 1. So 7 plus 1 is 8. So the transform origin of this one on the y-axis should be 8 pixels. So after we do that, let's see if that helps us get that bar in position. It looks like it does. It's now moving it over to the center of our mobile icon. So that's certainly helpful. Let's see if we can do the same thing with the other one. So I'm going to say style equals transform origin. And this is also going to be 12 pixels for the X value. The Y value is going to be a little bit different because it starts at 15. So now it's 15 plus 1. That's going to be 16 pixels. Let me go ahead and add a comma there, hit save. And now we have our X. So now we know what we want to do. Now it's just a matter of actually making this animate into position rather than just popping this into position the way that we have. In order to do that, let's go ahead and comment out our transforms. So we aren't going to apply these via style. We're going to apply them via framer motion. So we need to bring in our framer motion components. So I'm going to import motion/React, and that should allow us to apply those framer motion components to these two SVG rectangles. So we're going to turn these into motion components by saying motion.rect for the first one. And we're also going to say the same thing for the second one, motion.rect, and that should allow us to be able to animate these components. The other thing we're going to want to do is bring in use animate. Use animate allows us to run ad hoc animations, meaning we get to control when the animation happens, and we also get to control multiple animations happening after each other. So that's exactly what we want. So that use animate hook is going to help us do that. So let's go ahead and bring that into our component as well. So I'm going to say const top line scope and top line animate is equal to use animate. And then we also need our bottom line. So I'm going to say const bottom line scope, and bottom line animate is equal to use animate again. So now we have two separate animation functions, one for our top line, one for our bottom line. And then to hook them into our actual JSX, we need to go ahead and get these scopes hooked to the proper components. So I'm going to say ref on this one is equal to top line scope. And then for the second one, we have another ref is equal to bottom line scope for the bottom line so that we can hook that to our animation function. You can see that I'm leaving the transform origin in place for both of these rectangles right now. And that's simply because I don't want to have to worry about that messing up our animations. I would like those transform origins to be there. We're just going to worry about the translations and the rotations for the specific animations themselves. So we'll come back up and see how we can create those animations. In order to do that, we need to look at this isOpen variable. Whenever it changes, we would like to make our animation timing based on that change. Well, when we're looking at doing things in relation to React state, one of the easiest ways to do that is to use an effect. So I'm going to say use effect, and that's going to run a function, and we're going to make that function run whenever isOpen changes. So when isOpen changes, we're going to run this function, and we're going to figure out what to do based on whether this is open. So we're going to say if it is open, so if is open, then of course we're going to want to animate our lines into place. So we're going to start with the top line animate function, and we're going to run a sequence. This animation sequence is first going to move our line down like we showed, and then it's going to rotate it. So to move our line down, we're going to say top line scope dot current to show what we're moving. And then we're going to say translate Y4 to translate that 4 pixels in the Y direction. And then the second part of this sequence is going to still, of course, be taking our top line scope dot current and then rotating it. So we're going to say rotate 45, or we could probably just say rotate 45 directly like that as a number. So if we save that, let's go ahead and switch our use state to true just to test this out. So I'm going to say true and hit save, and hopefully we should see our animation happen. And you did. You saw it go down and then turn. So I'm going to switch that back to false. And it won't animate. Well, it will go ahead and refresh the page, so that'll work. But let's go ahead and switch this back to true one more time and go ahead and watch this animation happen. We'll go ahead and hit save one more time, and you can see that it does come down and it rotates if the isOpen is true. So that's exactly what we wanted to happen. Of course, we need to animate our bottom line as well. So let's go ahead and just copy and paste this because we're not going to switch around too much, and go ahead and hit paste there. And so we'll say bottom line animate. Of course, we're going to be switching this to bottom line scope dot current. And then we're going to be translating this a little bit differently. So we're going to be translating Y in the negative direction in that case, and rotating also in the negative direction. So we can add negative numbers for both of those and go ahead and hit save. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and switch this back. So I'm going to switch this back to false and see if we see our normal bars, and then switch it back to true. And let's see once I hit save if we see that animation happen for both of these. And that is a beautiful animation. I really like how that looks. So now we just need to switch it and make sure that it can animate back into the right position. So this is going to be the other side of this isOpen. So if isOpen is true, we run these two animations. I'm going to code fold these up so that they're a little bit easier to see what we're doing here. And then I'm going to say else, then we're also going to run both top line animate and bottom line animate, but we're going to put these back into their normal position. So top line animate, and of course, top line scope dot current is what we're going to be running this against. And in this case, we want the rotation to happen first. We want it to rotate back into position, and then we want the translation to happen after that. So I'm going to say rotate 0, and then we're going to run another part of our sequence here with us separating that by a comma, and say top line scope dot current translate Y to 0. So we're just getting that back to its normal position. And we're going to do the same thing for the bottom line. Let me go ahead and copy and paste this top line animate, come down to our bottom line and say bottom line animate. Of course, we're going to be running this with the bottom line scope, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to rotate back to 0, and we're going to translate back to 0 if this is no longer open. It doesn't like that we don't have all of the animation scopes and functions that we're using. We can go ahead and add those in. That's not going to be a problem because those are never going to change. So we can say top line animate, top line scope scope, bottom line animate, and bottom line scope. And there we go. Hit save again. That's not going to change anything. The only thing that's going to change is our isOpen variable. But if it wants this in here, that's not a problem either. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and save this again. I'm going to save this to false just to reset it back to what it was. And now let's go ahead and update our page whenever someone clicks on this mobile navigation icon. So let's come down to that mobile navigation icon. This should be within this div right here. So we need to add an on-click handler to change this. We'll say on click, and then we can just run an inline function. That's probably the easiest way to handle this. So we'll run an inline function that basically sets isOpen to the opposite value of what it currently is. So not is open, and go ahead and hit save. After we've done that, let's try clicking this and see if it actually switches around. And yes, we do have now a beautiful opening and closing animation. I'm really happy with how that looks. And it's always exciting to me when I see these animations come to life. So now we can just go ahead and remove these comments. We don't need these comments anymore. Those were just to kind of guide us as we went. After that, what would be great is if we actually had a mobile nav to show when the mobile nav opened. So right now we have the button animation working, but of course, no mobile nav is actually showing on the page. We do want one to show. And this is actually going to be another layer inside of our header. So far we have one layer that sits on top that holds our contact and our button. We have another layer that sits under that holds our logo. Well, this layer is going to sit under the logo. So we need yet another layer, another div to add into here. This is also going to be a class name of fixed, top 0, left 0, width full. And for now, because we're going to be cutting this up, we're also going to say height full, and that should make it full height. And we're going to want to give this a background color. So I'm going to say BG Stone 900, and that should give it that nice dark background color. After we've done that, let's go ahead and put our nav items inside of this container. So we'll go ahead and create a nav element. And inside that nav element, we are going to be running through each of our nav items. We already have that array at the top of our component. Let me go ahead and fold a couple of these things up so they're not getting in the way of us being able to see. We have const nav items as an array. We can go ahead and run through that. So I'm going to say nav items.map, and each of those items, let's go ahead and destructure that for a label and an href. And for each one of those, we're of course going to return some JSX. Each one of those JSX elements is going to be wrapped by a div, and then it's going to have an a tag with an href of the href that we're using. Or in fact, we can go ahead and reverse that. Let's go ahead and wrap the a tag around everything. That's always a better way to do it. So let me go ahead and wrap this a tag around here, say href equals href. And of course, we're going to have a key since we're mapping over. So that key can just simply be the label. And go ahead and end that, wrap that around our div, and that should create that link. And then inside the div, of course, we're going to want our actual text. So we'll say label inside of that div, and that should start to show our nav items. Now, our background is Stone 900, but we haven't changed the text color of any of these, so that's not going to allow them to show up yet. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and come to our a tag and say class name equals text Stone 200, just to give it an almost white color for each of those nav items. Right now, our navigation items are showing underneath of our header, so we'd like to change that. Let's go ahead and give this nav a class name of MT20. That'll just make sure that it's pushed down underneath of our header as well. And then we'd like to make these much more stylized. I actually don't like that we have this div here. Let me go ahead and change that to a span. That's kind of bothering me. But we'd like to make this much more stylized than we have it right now. So let me go ahead and take my nav and say flex call. And then inside of each of my links, let me go ahead and flex these side by side with an arrow next to each of these as well. So I'm going to go inside of my assets, go inside of my icons, find my arrow up right. Just go ahead and copy and paste this into each of my nav items as this SVG, and then change this around so that we have this as valid JSX. So we're going to change any of our dash case to camel cased attributes. So that's going to be these stroke line cap, stroke line join, and stroke width. That should make that valid JSX. And then inside of here, we can simply say flex items center justify between, and that will make sure that these items are next to that arrow. We also probably need to rearrange this a little bit because we are going to want to have this content not bumping up against the sides of our screen. So we'll probably want to put a container inside of here as well. So I'm going to say .container and go ahead and wrap this around both of these items, which is going to force us to move our flexed classes into that container instead. So I'm going to say container and then move our flex classes in there. And that should help our items not bump up against the sides of the screen. Of course, this container is going to follow the same pattern that we've been following with all of our other containers, at least at the top. It's going to be full width no matter what. So we're going to say exclamation max width full, and that should ensure that even if the screen size grows really large, these are still going to be full width, but still not bump up against the sides of the screen. In order to style our nav items, let's go ahead and add some borders to the top. So I'm going to say border T, and that border is going to be a stone 800 color. We'd also like for our last item to also have that border. So over next to border T, we'll say last border B, just to add a bottom border to our very last item. We also want to add a little bit of top and bottom padding. So we'll say PY8 to add that top and bottom padding just to spread these out a little bit. And of course, we want the text to be a little bit bigger in here as well. So inside of our span tag, I'm going to add a class name here and say text 3XL. And that should make our font size much bigger and much easier to see. Now that we have our mobile navigation in place, we can start to animate this mobile nav on and off the screen. So I'd like to go ahead and do that by animating this fixed div. So right now it's height full. We'd like to switch it from height 0 to height full when it's on the screen and back to height 0 when it's off the screen. And we can do the same thing with use animate like we've done before. So I can go ahead and say const nav scope, and nav animate is equal to use animate as our function there. And then we can add that ref here. We're going to say ref equals nav scope, and that should tie that nav animate now to this fixed div. We do want to make sure that it's in the position that it would be in when we start without the mobile nav open. So we'll say H0 here, and we also want to say overflow hidden. That will make sure that nothing overflows that container when it is height 0. Now to hook that up, what we can do is come inside of our use effect and come below our bottom line animate and also say nav animate. And this is a pretty easy one. We're just going to say nav scope dot current, and then we're going to tell it what to do. Of course, we're going to want the height to go to 100%, and we'll have the duration of that happen over 700 milliseconds. So I'm going to say duration 0.7, and that should make that navigation animation happen to a height 100% over that 700 millisecond duration. Of course, we also want this to close when we hit the close button. So let me fold these up a little bit so we can see a little bit easier inside of our else. We want to say nav animate, nav scope dot current, and we're going to set the height to 0. And we're going to allow the default duration to take place there. So now that I've done that, it is giving me an error that's saying that I don't have nav animate and nav scope in here either. So I'm going to add nav scope and nav animate. Once again, those functions don't change, so it's not going to affect the way that our use effect works. It's just going to make ESLint happy with what we've done here. So let's try this out. Let's go ahead and click this button and see if our navigation shows up and if it goes away when we have our mobile navigation closed. And I'm seeing that that is looking like it's working really well. I'm happy with how that works, but now we'd like to add some animation to our mobile nav items as well to make them animate as a user hovers over them. What we'd like to do is when a user hovers one of these items, we'd like to change the padding to the left of our label. And we'd also like for a little absolutely positioned div to animate into place. You'll see what I'm saying here in 1 second. Let me go ahead and start to make some of these changes. So the first one is going to be group. We're going to give this a custom group of group nav item. And then when that nav item is hovered, we can say group hover / nav item. Then we can make some changes. We're going to say PL4, and we're also going to add a transition to this as well. So we'll say transition, and then we'll say duration 500, and hopefully that should, as we hover over these, transition these into place. Let's go ahead and check on that here after the page updates completely. Okay, so it's happening, but it's happening very quickly. So we'd like to maybe switch this to a transition all to ensure that it's taking all of our properties and transitioning all of them, including our padding. So let's see if that works. I'm going to come back and hover over one of these elements. And now you can see after this updates, now you can see that we have this smooth transition that happens if we hover over one of these elements, which looks really nice, but we're not quite done yet. We also need to animate some sort of background color behind that. So in order to do that, we need to add a relative class because we're going to add an absolute position class inside of each of these links. So I'm going to code fold my div, come down here and add another div, give this a class name of absolute width full height 0. And this is also going to have a background color of stone 800. And then when we hover over one of these nav items, so I'm going to say once again, group hover nav item, then we'll switch the height to full. And of course, we are going to be transitioning this as well. So we'll say transition duration 500, and we'll see if that works well. So it looks like we have a little bit of an issue because we also need to set bottom to 0 to make sure that it is tying this absolutely positioned div to the bottom. And we also probably want to isolate this and make the Z index different than our div here. So I'm going to say isolate up here, and then I can say negative Z10, and hopefully that will allow us to have this work well. So it doesn't look like the transition is happening. So let's switch this once again to transition all and see if that allows our transition to happen. And now that we've switched that, let's come over into our mobile navigation. And now you can see we have this great effect that happens when we hover over one of these. We have this little background change that looks super slick. And we also have these items kind of moving over to show that they're hovered. So this is a great CSS only effect, but it's a great looking effect. And I really like the level of polish that it adds to this mobile nav. So let me go ahead and close this. And now we can see that that does once again go back into position. So all of that is looking really good right now. I really like where that's at. Let's see this across some different screen sizes. So let me pull out my browser window all the way, come over to my biggest screen size and go ahead and open this navigation. You can see that even at this screen size, this is looking just buttery smooth. Really, really nice. I like what we've done here. Now, so far our mobile navigation looks great, but what's even better than a great looking navigation is a working navigation. So let's come back into our header and make sure before we finish up this section that we have a working mobile navigation. So I'm going to slide my browser window back all the way over, go over to my mobile view because we can still see all of our mobile nav items over in this mobile view. And then we're going to link up the hrefs that we see in the top of our header.tsx file. Each of these has a separate href. We're going to link these up to the separate sections in this page. So for our intro, we're going to need to go into our intro.tsx and add an ID of intro to this section. The same thing is true for projects. We're going to want to go into projects and add the ID of projects. Back in our header, testimonials has an ID of testimonials. I'm going to just copy and paste that one into testimonials and say ID equals testimonials. We also have FAQs. So we want to go into FAQs and say ID equals FAQs. And then for contact, we want to link that to the footer. So we should be able to go into the footer and say ID equals contact, and that should allow us to link that up as well. So I'm going to go ahead and close these other sections down, but that should allow us to at least have a selector to be able to find to link that up. Now that's enough to link this up, but that's not necessarily what we want, because what we could do is we could go into each of these nav items and we could say, okay, if this link is clicked, go ahead and close the mobile nav, and that will instantly transport the user down to that section. So I could say on click and then basically say, go ahead and set is open to false and save that. And let's see what happens when we just have that very basic sort of navigation. So I'm going to open this up, go to about, and it instantly transports them to about. If I click the mobile navigation again and go to selected works, it instantly transports them over to my projects. That's great, but we'd like probably more of a smooth scroll effect rather than having the user jolted to that particular navigation item. So instead of having this on click happen this way, let's go ahead and actually just make this a full-fledged function. So I'm going to say handle click mobile nav item, and then we're going to create that function that runs whenever someone clicks that. So I'm going to say const handle click mobile nav item is going to be equal to a function. And for TypeScript, this is going to be a mouse event coming from React, and it's going to be on an HTML anchor element. And then we're going to run some code with that event. We don't want the normal event to happen, so we're going to say e.prevent default just to make sure that we don't have that normal snap of our navigation. And we're also going to want to automatically set is open to false. So we'll just go ahead and add that in because we know if one of those is clicked, we do want to hide our mobile navigation. But then here's where this gets a little bit interesting. What we're ultimately going to want to do is find some sort of target to go to, some sort of element. So we're going to want to say element, and then we're going to want to use the scroll into view function, which is just a JavaScript function that we can use with the behavior of smooth. Now that'd be great, but of course we have to find what that element is that we want to scroll into view. We can get that off of our event, but let's see what it gives us. So let's go ahead and go and console log e.currentTarget.href to see what that href is. And so I'm going to pull up my DevTools in this browser by just going and pulling up my bottom bar. We have this pane here. We have these DevTools. So let's go ahead and select our mobile pane. And then this should print out our href when we click an item. So let's go ahead and open up an item. Go ahead and click this one. And you can see that the href that it prints out is not just the href that we've given it, which is just hash intro. It's actually the entire URL. So we need to get just that hash off of there. So we're going to say const URL is going to be equal to a new URL. This is a browser function. And we're going to take in the e.currentTarget.href as the URL that we have. And then we're just going to get the hash by saying const hash is going to be equal to URL.hash. And that will allow us to have what we need. And let's go ahead and console.log that hash just to make sure we're getting exactly what we want. So I'm going to save this, go ahead and click one of these nav items again. And now we see we just have that hash, which is exactly what we need in order to be able to find that element on the page. After we do that, we can say const target is equal to document.querySelector. So we're going to find that element and we're just going to pass this the hash. And that should give us either an element or it's going to give us null. So we'll basically say, okay, well, if that element doesn't exist, that shouldn't be the case. But if we don't have that target, we can just return. Otherwise, let's go ahead and scroll that into view. So we're going to use basically this same thing right here. Just going to copy and paste this right below here. And we're going to switch this out to target. So we're going to say target.scroll into view with the behavior of smooth. And I'm going to also go ahead and take out my console log because we don't need that anymore, as well as my commented code. So after I've saved that, let me go ahead and come back into my mobile nav. Let me click on selected works. And now you can see that at least it's giving this a little bit of a scroll to show the user that something is happening, which is probably more apparent once I go ahead and close out of my DevTools. So let me scroll all the way back up to the top. Let me go to something like contact. And you can see that now it's scrolling down to my contact section with the smooth behavior rather than just jumping the user down there, which is definitely a better effect. With that, I'm really happy with where this page is at. Let's just go ahead and try that one more time on the desktop view. Let me go ahead and open up something like testimonials, and you can see that it scrolls right down to those testimonials. That's a really nice effect. I like that we have a working mobile navigation. That's also a really great thing to have. With that, let's go ahead and move on to the hero section animations. Now that we're done with our header animations, let's go ahead and work on our hero animations. So let's go into our source/sections and go to our hero.tsx and go ahead and pull this file up so we can talk about what we want to animate in our hero section. So there's going to be a couple of things we're going to want to do. The first thing is we're going to want to animate this text in. We're also going to want to animate the buttons in. We're going to want to add some hover effects to the buttons, and we're going to want to add a nice effect to this image, at least at the tablet and the desktop size, where as we scroll down, what we'd like to happen is for the image to cover the screen until we continue scrolling. And then when we go back up, we'd like the image to go back into place. So that's going to be an interesting effect that you don't usually see on websites, but it's going to be a one that's really going to set this particular page apart. And we're going to do all that right here in this section. The first thing I'd like to do is handle the text animation. And for that text animation, what we're going to do is we're going to target this H1 right here, and we're going to split it into lines and words. And then we're going to go ahead and transition each word in independently. And we're going to do all of that with motion. So let's go ahead and import what we need. So we're going to import, first of all, we're going to import split type. Split type is a library that allows us to go ahead and split a group of words into lines and words individually and add classes to each of those. And we're also going to pull in use animate, of course. So use animate from motion/React, and that'll allow us to control the animations themselves. We also want to go ahead and pull in motion because we're going to create a motion.h1 right here. You'll see what I mean in just a second. So let's do the easy things first. Let's go ahead and create a motion.h1. The reason we're going to do this is because when the page loads, we would like to not be able to see this h1 until it translates onto the page. And in order to do that, we can just add a little bit of an animation here. We can say that initially it's going to be opacity 0, but when it comes in, we'll set the animate value to opacity 1. And that'll just ensure that when the page loads until the JavaScript comes into the page, we're not going to see the H1 at all. Now, the second thing we'd like to do is go ahead and add our animation scope. And let me show you how split type works, exactly what it's doing, so that we can animate each word individually onto the page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and say const title scope, and title animate is going to be equal to use animate. And we're going to go ahead and attach this scope directly to our H1 just by saying ref equals title scope. And that will make sure that this title animate is going to reference this particular H1 element right here. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and create a use effect. So I'm going to say use effect from React, and this is going to be a function that's going to run when this component first loads. So we're going to have an empty dependency array, and I'm not going to run the animation right now. Instead, what I'm going to do first is go ahead and use this split type, and I'm going to show you how it splits this title text into separate lines and words. So I'm going to say new split type, and it's going to take a target. So it can be anything, including an HTML element. Well, we already have a target available to us. We can just say title scope.current. That's a target we can use. And then we need to give it some options. So we're going to say that the types of split that we want are both lines and words. So you have lines, characters, and words you can select. We're just going to do lines and words for now. And we also want to set the tag name. So we're going to say tag name in this case is going to be a span tag. And then we can go ahead and save this. After we've done this and this page has reloaded, let's go ahead and open up our dev tools so we can take a look at what this split type library actually did. So I'm going to select my mobile pane, and I'm going to select this inspector right here, and we're going to inspect this title here. And what you're going to see as I close down my console and come to my elements is that we've actually taken our H1 and split it into separate lines, and each one of those has a span with a class of line. And then each word in that line is also a span tag with a class of word. Let's see if I can zoom this in any more so you can get a better look at what this looks like. But this is exactly what we need for this animation. We want to see where our lines are. And of course, we want each of our words to be wrapped so that we can target those individually. So this library does that perfectly for us. So with that, let me go ahead and close out that library because we know what's going on. And now let's talk about what CSS we need to run or what JS we need to run in order to make this animation happen. In order to set up this kind of pre-animation here, I'm going to come into my app and come into my globals. And here we're going to add a little bit of CSS for each of our lines and words to make sure that they're hidden by default. So basically, if we split our text with this split type library, we want to go ahead and hide those by default. So for our .line class, we're going to add @apply overflow hidden. And then for our words, we're going to say .word, and we're going to apply @apply translate y full, and that should push our words down so that they cannot be seen. Now this translate y full actually hides each word within a line. Let me show you exactly how it works by just translating this a little bit less. Let me say translate y 1/4. And you can see with this translation, it's pushing it down by a quarter. If we go to a half, it's pushing it down by half. And you can see that essentially each line, since it has an overflow hidden rule, this translation is pushing the text outside of that and essentially hiding it because the text is being pushed outside of that overflow hidden box. And then if we go to 3/4, so translate Y 3/4, it should be almost all gone. And then when we say full, it should be completely disappeared from the page because of that translation. After we've done that, let's come back to our hero and talk about how we can animate this back onto the page. So because we know that our split type has taken our ref and created some lines and words inside of our H1, that means that we can query that title scope, find those words, and then animate them individually. So I'm going to run title animate, and we're going to run this function on our title scope.current.query selector all word. So basically we're finding any word inside of our title scope, and then we're going to run a transition on that. So we're going to go ahead and run a transform, and we're going to translate Y to 0. So it's going from 100% to 0. And then we're going to do that over a duration of half a second with a delay of stagger 0.2. And we need to also import that stagger so that we can use that. So that's something from Motion/React as well. So we can go ahead and import that so that we can use that. So let's go ahead and save this and see what this animation looks like when we refresh our page. So as soon as we refresh our page, you can see that we have this great animation that comes in word by word. We have this duration of half a second, but each one of these is starting 0.2 seconds after the last. So let me go ahead and replay that one more time so you can see that animation one more time. That looks really nice, and it was really easy to accomplish just by splitting our title up and then finding all of those words, transforming them to translate Y0, and then staggering each one of those words in by 0.2 seconds. So that's a great effect, but what would really make this hero pop is to also go ahead and hide our buttons and go ahead and animate those onto the page after we have our title animated onto the page. So we can do that pretty easily with Framer Motion as well. Let's come down and wrap each of our buttons inside of a motion div. So I'm going to wrap my first button inside a motion.div and go ahead and take that ending motion.div, put it around my ending button, go ahead and hit save to that. And then I'm also going to wrap my second button inside another motion.div and go ahead and take that ending tag and wrap it around my button as well. As soon as I've done that, this motion.div, of course, allows me to have some props that I can add to control this animation. So I'm going to say that the initial position of this is going to be opacity 0 and Y 100%. And then the animation, or what it's going to go to, is going to be opacity 1 and Y 0. And then we can also control the transition by adding this transition prop. And we can say that the duration is going to be 0.5 and the delay is going to be somewhere around probably about 1.5 seconds, but we can go ahead and change that if we don't like how that looks. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page and see how that looks with that delay. So we see the words come on and we see the button come on. That's a little bit quicker than I'd like. So I'm going to change this to 1 3/4 seconds. Go ahead and save this and take another look at what that looks like. So after that button comes on, that looks really good. It looks like it's in line with everything else on the page. So let's go ahead and duplicate this and go ahead and put it into our second motion div that's wrapping our second button and save that. And then just go ahead and change this delay to probably about 2 seconds. So let me go ahead and save this and see how it all looks together with the title and our two buttons. So I'm going to refresh this and let's see this all work together. That looks really good. We can even slow this down just a little bit more. Let's do 2.2 and see how we feel about that delay. I'm going to refresh this and take one more look at this. That looks really nice. I really like how that ended up. So I'm going to keep that as is. Let's look at this at the desktop size as well. So I'm going to scroll over to our desktop size. Go ahead and hit the refresh here and see this happen on the desktop size. That just looks so great. It's always great to see these animations come together. So let me go ahead and put that back over there and come back to our mobile view and see what else we need to do at this screen size. The next thing we'd like to work on is our button animation. So we want these buttons to both change color when we hover, and we'd also like this icon to move over and kind of create this interesting effect. And for the text button, we'd like a little line to come underneath of it when it's hovered and then go away when it's not. So we'll work on all of that, most of that within the button component. So I'm going to go over to my button component inside of my components folder and go ahead and add some class names here to make this happen. The first class name should be fairly simple. So we need to add on our secondary variant. We need to say hover BG red orange 500. And we also need to add on hover text white. And that should ensure that our button background changes. Let's go ahead and see how that works. And that's an instantaneous change right now. We definitely don't want that to be the case. So we also need to make sure that we add some transitions here as well. So I'm going to come into my base class and say transition and duration 500 and see if that adds a better effect. So I'm going to go ahead and hover over my button now. And now we are at least seeing a little bit of a transition with that background color and that text color. And it looks like my duration isn't quite right because I didn't add the dash there. So I'm going to go ahead and save that again and see if we get a slower duration when we hover over it. Okay, so now we get a more smooth effect. I like where that's at. Right now, I'm not going to touch the icon yet because we're going to have to do that inside of our hero code, but we can take care of our text variant border. So let's see how we'd like to do that. I think what I'd like to do is go ahead and add an after element to our text button, and then we can animate that. So I'm going to say after content empty, and this is basically just going to be an empty content string so that we can start to animate this after element. We'd like the after element to be a height of 1 pixel, so HPX. We'd also like the after element to be a width of 0 at first. We'd like the after element to be position absolute. We'd also like it to be 100% from the top, so say after top full. We'd like the background on that after element to be the red orange 500, so we'll say after BG red orange 500, and then we'll say hover after width full, and let's see if that works. And it doesn't work quite yet because we need a relatively positioned container to hold our after element. So I'm going to also add the relative class up here on our button, and that should hopefully allow this to work. Now we're seeing this work, but it's quickly coming onto the screen and quickly going off. We'd like to add an animation to that. So we also need to add some of the same transitions to our after element. So we'll say after transition all, and then we'll also say after duration 500 as well. So I'll go ahead and save that and see if we now see that transition when we hover over this button. And it looks like we now do. We now see that nice little line that comes underneath. The same thing for this one. We now have a nice transition for that. So let's see how we can also transition our icon to play along with this same animation. Coming back to our hero.tsx, let's go ahead and take a look at that. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this icon, and then we're going to put it in a couple of wrappers so that we can hide it and transition it whenever this button is hovered. One of the things I forgot about, we need to go back into button real quick, is because we need to have some sort of group to be able to listen to for those transitions, since this is going to be a CSS transition. So I'm going to add a custom group here. I'm going to say group/button, and that should allow me to listen to hovers to that group inside of my icon. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and come back to my hero. And now that that's taken care of, the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and wrap a div around my SVG. I'm actually going to wrap 2 divs around my SVG. So I'm going to go create another one in that. And this is going to be the second div. And then I'm also going to have 2 SVGs. So I'm just going to duplicate this and add it as a sibling element. So you should have 2 divs that contain 2 SVGs that are going to probably fall top to bottom right now. Since these are size 5, we can easily create containers for this to make sure we have the right amount of space for this. So I'm going to say on my internal div, class name equals h5 width 10, because it's going to be double the size of our icon. And then I'm going to flex that. So I'm going to say flex, and then we should see our icons line up next to each other. Now, of course, we don't want to see both of those icons at once. So we're going to come into our outer div, give this a class name of overflow hidden and size 5, and that should allow us to just see one of those icons at once. After we've done that, we can just come into our internally flexed div and go ahead and add a couple of classes on this to make this animation work. So what we're going to want to do is when the group button is hovered, we are going to want to add a negative translate X 1/2 to move our icon over by 1/2. And then we're also going to want to add some transitions onto this. So I'm going to say transition, transform, and duration 500. And let's go ahead and save that and see if that works. So when we hover our button, we should see our icon move back and forth, and that's exactly what we see. It also transitions color from the button itself. So this is a really nice looking effect once this is done, and it's all CSS based. Just a really nice, easy effect to implement in our button. Now that we have that done, the last thing we want to do inside of our header is make sure that we can transition our image as we scroll down the page. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this out so we can see our tablet view a little better. I'm also going to put down our sidebar so that we can see our code a little bit better. And then we'll talk about how we're going to transition this image as we scroll. Anytime we're creating a scroll transition where we want to keep things in place, one of the best ways to do that is to have an empty div that you track the scroll position of, and then have a sticky div that holds your content. Let me show you what I mean. So we're going to go inside of our header, and we're going to say that this grid right here that contains our content, this is going to be a sticky div, and it's going to stick to the top of the screen. So I'm going to add on sticky and then top 0. And that's going to create that sticky div. Now, it's not going to matter if we don't have content that comes after it, that it's waiting for before it continues to scroll. So even though we've added sticky, nothing changes yet. So we need to add another div below it that's going to create some space to allow this to stick to the top of the screen as we scroll. And this is going to be another div. I'm just going to code fold that up real quick and create a div with a class name of H200VH. This is going to be 200% of the screen height. And then in order for us to be able to see this, I'm just going to add a border to this as well. So I'm going to say border for border red 500, and that should allow us to see this as we scroll up the page. So let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to go ahead and start scrolling, and you can see that that div is coming onto the screen. It's now at the top of the screen, and then we're going to go all the way down, and then we're going to see the bottom of that, and that's when we're going to continue to scroll. So this is going to be invisible, so we're not going to actually see this div that I've currently created here, but I just wanted to show you where it was so that you understood how this is working. The next thing we're going to need to do is track the scroll progress of this div, and we're of course going to do that with motion. So I'm going to come into the top of my component, and we're going to add a use scroll handler. And of course, to add that use scroll handler, we are going to have a target that we want to track, and we're going to track that with a React ref. So I'm going to say const scrolling div is going to be equal to use ref, and I'm going to import that from React, and that is going to be an HTML div element with a default value of null. And then we can just hook that up to our div. So let's come back down here, go ahead and say ref equals scrolling div. And that should hook that ref to this div right here. For now, I am going to leave the border on so we can just tell what's going on. So that's going to be on there for now, but I'll take that off here in a minute. The other thing we want to do is go ahead and import use scroll so we can track the scroll of that from motion. So I'm going to say const scroll y progress is equal to use scroll from motion/react. The target for that is going to be our scrolling div, and the offset is going to be from the start end to end end. And essentially what that means is when the start of that div reaches the end of our page, like it currently is now, until the end of that div reaches the end of our page, like it will be when it's done scrolling, that's what we're tracking. So essentially we're tracking the scroll from this position right here where we don't see it, where the start of it is right at the end of our page, all the way through until the end of this box is at the end of our page right about there. So that's what we're tracking, and that's going to be a number between 0 and 1. So this scroll by progress is going to be equal to 0 when we're all the way scrolled up, and then as we scroll down, it's going to get to 1 as this gets to the end of our page, and this is going to be 1 from here on out. So essentially we're going to use that number, this 0 to 1 number, in order to change the size of our image. In order to do that, let's go ahead and create a new variable called portrait width, and we'll set that equal to a use transform. Now a use transform hook in motion.react is basically going to take one number or one set of numbers and transform it to another range of numbers. So we're going to take our scroll Y progress, and as that transforms from 0 to 1, we're going to transform the width of this from 100%, which it currently is, to 240%. Now, if you're wondering how we got that 240%, that is basically just based on our columns. So we have 12 columns. This portrait is currently taking up 5 of those 12. And so to get that to 12, we need to do a little math and say, what is 12 over 5? Well, that is equal to 2.4. And of course, if we're translating that to a percentage, that is multiplied by 100. So that's going to be equal to 240%. So that's how we got that number, 240%. Now that we have that, let's see if we can implement that on our portrait. So I'm going to open back up my grid div. I'm going to come down to my call span 5 and see what we can do in order to make this work. So what we can do is we can go into our div that is surrounding our image, and we need to be able to make this absolute so that it can continue to grow in order to cover the entire hero. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a relative container here in my call span 5 div. And then inside of this one, we already have h full. Well, in this medium size, we actually probably want this, after this is relative, to be size full. And we also want to change this over to an absolute position div. So I'm going to say medium absolute. That should change it over to an absolutely position div. Now, it hasn't yet changed anything, but let's see what we can do with style to see what happens when we grow beyond a width of 100%. So I'm going to start with a width of 100%, and then I'm going to change this value and see what happens. So I'm going to go up to 150%, go ahead and hit save, and it's growing, but it's growing in the wrong direction. So we're also going to need to say right 0. So I'm going to say medium right 0 to make sure that it's tied to the right side of the page. So now we have it at 150%. Once we get to 200%, you can see that that is almost covering. And once we get to our 240%, you can see that that's going to cover the hero. So we want to essentially do this very same thing, but we're going to need to do this, of course, with motion so that it animates. And we're also going to need to make sure that it only takes effect at the medium size and up so that we're not messing up our small sized image. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and change this over to a motion.div. Let me make sure I have motion imported already. Looks like I do. So I can come back down and go ahead and change this over to motion.div. Same thing with our ending, motion.div there. And then of course, this style, this width is going to be equal to portrait width. And then we just need to make sure that our width only takes effect at the medium size and up. So I'm going to say max medium, which essentially says anything below the medium size, go ahead and make this width full with an important rule. So after I've done that, let's go ahead and start to scroll and see what happens with our portrait. So you can see that we still have our border there, so it's showing you where that's scrolling. And then once it gets all the way to the end, then we'll continue to scroll. So that's a really great effect. I really like how that works. And the only other thing we're going to want to do is, of course, make sure that our header is pulled above it and take off our red border. So I'm going to go ahead and take off this red border first. And then we're going to make sure that our header is pulled above this by going into our header. I'm going to pull back in my sidebar, go to my header.tsx, and make sure we have the proper Z index for all of these fixed divs. So it needs to be at least Z10. So we're going to say Z10 on that one. We're also going to come into the next fixed div and say Z10 on that one as well. And then we're going to come into our third fixed div and say Z10 on that one as well. After that, I think this should work really well. So let's go ahead and take one more look at this animation. That's really nice. And then let's go ahead and see this in the desktop view as well. I put down my sidebar, pull my browser window out. You can see that we have that entrance animation. Let's go ahead and refresh the page to see that entrance animation work with all of our content in our header. So you can see the buttons are coming in. We have these animations when we hover over each of these buttons. And then as we scroll, we can see this image get bigger until it's taking up the full width, and then we scroll down. So that's a really neat effect that definitely is going to catch someone's eye as they're scrolling through this portfolio section. And of course, we want to make sure that nothing has changed on our mobile view. And I do see that we still have this sticky header effect going on, even though our image size hasn't changed. So let's go ahead and just make sure we take care of that before we move on. And that's basically due to the fact that we have all the way down here at the bottom of our hero, we have this height 200 and our sticky div. Our sticky div is not going to matter if this doesn't have any height. So I'm going to say medium H200VH. And that should ensure that it only grows to that height of 2 times our screen when it gets to the medium screen size. So now we should be able to scroll normally on mobile, and then on our tablet, we should have that scrolling effect. So that is really great. I really like how that turned out. I hope you do as well. But with that, we're ready to move on to our next section of animations. Now that we're done animating our hero and our header, let's go ahead and move down to our intro section and see what animations we want to add to this particular section. And let's go into our code. Let's go into our source/sections/intro.tsx and see what we need to do in order to make this section work. What we'd like to do is have this intro text animate in sort of like what we have in our hero, but we'd like this to happen when this scrolls into view instead of just happening when the page loads. So it's going to be just a little bit different, but a lot of it is going to be very similar. So in order to do that, what we need to do is use our use in view hook from motion. So let me go ahead and say const in view is equal to use in view, and that's going to be imported from motion/react, and then it needs a scope. Well, we know that we can get a scope and an animation function, which is of course what we're going to need to use to animate this intro from our use animate hook. So let me go ahead and import that. Let me say const scope and animate is equal to use animate from motion/react. And that will give us everything we need for this use in view. So we need our scope here, and we're also going to say that this is only going to happen once. So I'm going to say once true to ensure that this in view only fires once. Now to hook up our scope, we are going to need to hook this into a section of the page. Since we're tracking the in view, we can just use this scope right here and attach it to our H2. So I'm going to say ref equals scope right to our H2, and then we can query anything in there that we need to query directly when we're animating our section. So I'm going to say when this section comes into view is when this animation is going to fire. Now you can see that it's giving me an error, and that's probably because we have not yet switched this over to a client component. So I'm going to come up to the top of this component and say use client. That'll make it a client component and should allow Next.js to render correctly. So I'm going to scroll back to my intro, and then it's time for us to go ahead and add this animation. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to this in view variable using a use effect. So I'm going to say use effect, and then we're going to run a function whenever our in view variable changes. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And that function is going to do a couple of things. Number one, it's going to split our type once again into lines and words. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say if it's in view, then we're going to say new split type and go ahead and get the H2 for that. So it's going to be scope.current.query selector H2, so we can get the H2 for that split type. And then we're going to give it some options. We're going to have types of lines and words, and it looks like it's not imported yet, so let me make sure that's imported. Let me go ahead and try and just re-import it by using it again and then hitting enter, and then it should import that on the top of my file. So we have types of lines and words, and then we have tag name of span to make each of those a span tag inside that H2. So that will take care of breaking out our H2 into lines and words, but it's not yet going to take care of animating it in. So you can see now that it's lines and words, because of our previous CSS that we have inside of our globals, I'll show you what that is real quick. Because we have this dot line overflow hidden and dot word translate y full, it's making sure that this text is hidden by default once this split type actually happens. So because that's the case, we probably don't want to wait till it's in view in order to actually run this split type function. We'd probably like to run it as soon as the component loads on the screen. So we can actually do that very easily just by creating another use effect. So I'm going to create another use effect above it. And this is going to be a function that just runs whenever the component loads, and it's just going to run this split type function. So I'm going to just cut and paste that right into here, and let's see what it needs. It says it needs a scope. So we can go ahead and add that. That's not going to change, so that's not going to affect that use effect function. And then down here in our in view, that's where we can run our animate function. So I'm going to say animate scope.current.query selector all.word. So we're going to animate all of our words. And the animation we're going to run on those words is we're going to transform our translate y value to 0 or 0%. Either one should work. And then we're also going to add a transition. The duration is going to be half a second, and the delay is going to be similar to what we saw in our hero. We're going to stagger this. So let me see if we can import stagger from motion/React, and then we're going to stagger these by 0.2 seconds. So after that, let me go ahead and save this. And now you can see that we have this great animation that happens when this section is in view. Now, if you scroll up and down, you shouldn't see it happen again. It should just happen once. But of course, if you refresh your page and then you come down to that section, you should see it happen. So after my hero animation happens, let me scroll down, and now I can see this great intro animation happen as well. Now this animation is completely done, but there is one thing I want to take care of here. It looks like there's an ESLint issue that I want to make sure that we address. So it says the use effect has missing dependencies, animate and scope. Both of those are functions, both of those won't change, and both of those will not affect the way that this works. So I'll just go ahead and add those in there so that it makes ESLint happy with what we've done. So after that, we have our intro animation done, and it's time to move on to the next section of our page. Moving on from our intro animation, it's time to move down to our projects. So you can see on mobile, we have these projects, but nothing really happens if we hover over any of these projects, and we'd like some sort of effect to occur as we hover over those on mobile, and then we'll change that a little bit when we get to our tablet and our desktop size. So let's go into our projects. Let's go into source/sections/projects, and let's see what we need to do in order to make this animation occur. So we'd like to do something sort of similar to what we're doing in our mobile nav. So you can see if we have our mobile nav, when it opens up, we have this great little background that transitions from a height of 0 to a height of 100%. We'd like to mimic that. We'd also like to mimic the icon animation that we're doing with our button, where we're kind of flipping that over. So we'd like to do that as well, at least in our mobile section, just to add a little bit of life to this section. We're not going to animate any sort of padding or move these words around. We're just going to do those couple of animations. So in order to add those, what we know is that we have a link that's wrapping each of our projects. So if we're going to add an absolutely positioned element to that, we certainly need to add a relatively positioned element somewhere, and that's going to be this link. And then below that, we know we're going to need an absolutely positioned element inside of here. So I'm just going to go ahead and put this directly inside of my A tag. I'm going to say div class name equals absolute, and that's going to be bottom 0, left 0, width full, H0. And then when we hover over our card, then it should go to H100%. So we need to also add a group class to our A. So I'm going to say group/project. And then inside of our div, we can say group hover/project, and then add some additional classes here. So I'm going to say H full, and then we'll also say transition and duration 500. So once we save that, let's see if that has the effect that we want. Of course, we also need to change the color of that. I forgot all about that. So even if this happens, we're not going to see it. So let's go ahead and change the color of that. That's going to be BG Stone 300, I believe. Let's go ahead and see what that color looks like. Let me scroll back down. And yes, we do see that, but we don't have any kind of transition, and we also have it covering our content. So let's go ahead and also go ahead and make our content position relative. And we also want to make sure that our transition switches to a transition all. That should make sure that it also transitions our height. So let's go ahead and see that now that we have that in place. I'm going to scroll back down, and now we do have that showing up, where we have this background transitioning up. It's a little bit hard to see because, of course, this is on mobile, so we just get a little bit of a view of it, but it does look pretty nice. Let me go ahead and slow this down by just a little bit. Let me go ahead and pull this down to a duration of 700. And go ahead and hit save again. Now to also make our icons flip, let's go ahead and find our icon. This is this SVG right here. So we're going to be doing the same thing we did before. We're going to wrap this in two divs. We're going to have an outer div, and we're also going to have an inner div. We could turn this into a component, and I might turn this into a component, but for now, we're just going to do it this way, and we're also going to duplicate our SVGs. This icon happens to be size of 6, which is going to change our scale a little bit. So we're going to say class name equals size 6 overflow hidden. And then for the internal one, we're going to say class name equals H6 width 12. And then we'll flex these next to each other using the flex rule. And we'll say when the group is hovered for each project, let's go ahead and add negative translate x 1/2. And we'll also add the transition. So we'll say transition, transform, and duration 700 because that's going to match the duration of our absolute positioned element animation. So let's go ahead and see this happen. Let me go ahead and scroll down again and come over to this, and you can see that we have now that nice little transition effect, but I think it's actually a little bit slow. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. Let's try transition duration 500 and see if that helps, and come back over to my projects. And now you can see that we have a little bit of a faster transition. I'm actually still not in love with that. I'm going to speed that up just a tiny bit and go to duration 300 and see if that helps. So I like that a little bit better. That just gives a more snappy effect, but still allows you to see those icons transitioning. And you also have the background effect here as well. So for mobile, I think these project animations are done. Let's go to our tablet view and see what else we need to do over there. So I'm gonna go ahead and open this up a little bit and scroll over to our tablet view. Scrolling down to our tablet view, you can see we have our projects. Let's see what we have so far. So this is already a pretty decent looking animation, but of course there's a little bit more we can do. We can show each of the projects as these are being hovered. In order to do that, let's go ahead and put in our sidebar and take a look at what changes we'll need to make to this code. So right now, what you're seeing right here is inside of a flexed div. So you have this flexed div right here with a justify between, you have your title, and then you have your icon over here with its size 6. So the image is going to need to go in between this title and this icon. But in order for that to happen, we probably need this to switch to a grid when it gets to this medium size. So I'm going to say medium grid. And then we're also going to have these template columns. So we'll say medium, and then we'll give this a custom value of grid template columns. And those columns are going to be 1 FR for 1 free space, 300 pixels for our image that we're going to add in. And then we're also going to have max content, and that's going to just make sure that the icon will take up exactly the space that it already takes up. We don't yet have any kind of gap in here either. So we'll say medium gap 8 to ensure that we have a little bit of spacing in between each of these elements. With that, let's go ahead and save this and see if we can drop our image in here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my image and then drop it into my grid in between my H3 and this icon div. So I'm going to drop this right here. Go ahead and hit, and I'm going to wrap that in a div. So that div is going to take care of my grid column. And then if we hit save on that, we should see our grid images showing up. Now we want our images to show up, but we don't want our images to take up that much space. In fact, we don't want them to take up any space until they show up on the page. So let's go ahead and wrap these in a div, each of these images. And then we can make this div position absolute. So I'm going to say class name equals absolute. We're also going to say aspect video to get these images to be 16:9 inside this absolute container. And then our absolute container is also going to be width full to make sure it takes up the full 300 pixel width that we already defined. Let's go ahead and give this div a class name of relative, and then go ahead and save that and see what that looks like. So this is good, actually. This is exactly kind of what we want. It's just that our images aren't in the right spot. So now we need to basically center our images inside of our relative div by saying top 1/2 and then negative translate y 1/2. And that will pull our images into the center of each of our selected works rows. Now all that's left for us to do is make these images show and hide based on the hover state of each project. So of course we want these to be opacity 0, and we also want them to scale down a bit. So we'll say opacity 0 and scale 90 to make them 90% scale. And then we'll say when the group is hovered, that is a project. Then we'll go ahead and set opacity to 100, and we'll also say group hover / project scale 110 to make it 110%. And let's go ahead and hit save. Now this shouldn't have a transition yet. It should just be an immediate pop from one state to the next, but let's at least go ahead and see this happen. So you see that pop is happening, and that's not too bad. That is what the state we want to get to, but of course it's not exactly how we want it to happen. So let's go ahead and add a transition to this. We'll say transition all duration 500. And we probably also want to add a little bit of a Z index to this as well. So I'm going to say Z10 and go ahead and hit save. So with that, let's go ahead and see how this looks. So now you have these images that are transitioning really nicely onto the page. I'm not sure if I actually love the scale 110. Let's just move this back to a scale of 100, and we might pull back our initial scale as well a little bit if we feel like it's not enough of an effect. So let's go ahead and see this again. I actually like that a little bit better. It's a little bit more subtle, and the image shows up more in proportion with the rest of these projects. With that, let's go ahead and see how this looks on desktop. Let's go over to our desktop view and scroll up a little bit so we can see our projects. And you can see, let me go ahead and move this over a little bit more. You can see that this is a pretty decent look. I think I might actually scale these up just a bit on desktop to make this a little bit bigger. So let's go over to our responsive code and say, that on the large size, we're going to say group hover / project, and we are going to scale those to 110. Let me go ahead and hit save and pull back out my desktop view so I can actually see that happen. So let's see each of our projects now. They're a little bit bigger on desktop. I definitely like that. But we also want to add a little bit more of an effect on desktop, because if you have a little bit more room, we have some room on the sides to go ahead and add a little bit of a padding transition. So I think that's what I'd like to do on these selected works. So let me come back into my code. And what we'll do is we'll add 2 divs. We'll add one div around our H3. That's going to be the column that holds our title in. And we'll just simply add a class name on that that says large group hover / project PL4 and transition all duration. Let's go with 700. And then around our icon, that's going to be this div right here. We're going to add another div that's just going to represent the column for that as well. And we'll say class name equals large group hover / project PR4. And we'll say transition all duration 700 as well. So after we save that, let's go ahead and see how that looks. I'm going to pull back out my desktop view and take another look at this. And that adds a nice effect, but I don't think it's quite enough. I think we need to go up and double that padding. So I'm going to come back into my code. Let's go ahead and make that PR8. And let's go ahead and scroll up and make that PL8 as well around our title so that we have a little bit more padding left and right. So I'm going to pull that back out and take one more look at this section. And that, I think, is a nice effect. It's going ahead and just adding that little bit of padding that just makes for an even more eye-catching animation. So I definitely like that on the desktop view. With that, let's go back and make sure all of our responsive views look good. So of course, on the tablet view, that looks good already. Let's go to the mobile view and see if there's anything that needs to change here. I'm not seeing anything right offhand. I think we're good to go. So let me just double check one more time to make sure that there's nothing that looks wrong, but everything looks right to me. So I think we're good with this section, and I think we're ready to move on to our testimonials animations. Now that we're done with our projects animations, let's go ahead and scroll down to our testimonials and talk about the kind of animations we'd like to see here. So the first animation we're going to create is one that's going to animate these words up here, the title. It's going to animate the top one to the left and the bottom one to the right as the user scrolls. So you're going to see a nice scrolling animation with that. Not there yet, but we're going to add it in. And then for each testimonial, what we'd like to do is, first of all, when we hover these testimonial buttons, we'd like to add a little bit of a transition. But when we click these, what we'd like to happen is for the testimonial to first animate out, and then the next testimonial to animate in, using some of the same text effects that we've been using for both our actual testimonial and for the user title. So we're going to do all of that in this testimonials section. So let's go ahead and first open up that testimonial section. Let's go to source/section/testimonials and see what we're going to need to do inside of this section to start and make these animations happen. The first thing we're going to do is bring in motion. We're actually going to bring in use scroll because we'd like to track the progress of this H2 container right here. So let's go ahead into the top of our file and import use scroll from motion/react. And since this is becoming a client component, we can go ahead and we already know that we're going to have to say use client to give this the use client directive so that this still renders once we hit save after we've imported these hooks. So we'd like to go ahead and say const scroll y progress is equal to use scroll. Now for our use scroll hook, we need a target and we need an offset. Well, we haven't defined the target yet, so let me go ahead and add an empty string for that. That's going to give us an error, but that's fine for now. And then for the offset, we'll say start, end, and then end, start. And that essentially means that when the start of this H2 that we're going to hook this to is at the end of the page, so about right here, until the end of the H2 is at the start of the page, so about right here, is when we're going to be tracking this scroll right progress, which is going to be a number between 0 and 1. Now let's go ahead and set our target. Let's go ahead and say const title ref is equal to use ref from React. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. That should import that. And then we'll go ahead and say that this H2 ref is equal to title ref. That will hook that up. It doesn't like that we haven't given this that type and null yet. Let me see if null will take care of that issue. Looks like it does. So after that, let's go ahead and change our target to title ref, and that should hook everything up. And then we just have this scroll right progress value that we have not yet used. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit save, make sure everything still renders. It looks like it does, which means we can start to transform our scroll right progress values into values we actually want to use. So what we're gonna do is we're going to make these two spans motion spans, and then we're gonna change their translate X value based on the position of our scroll. So let's first go ahead and make those motion spans by going to the top of our file and going ahead and importing motion from React. And then we'll change these to motion.span, and we'll have an ending motion.span here. And the same thing for the second one, we'll say that this is a motion.span, and we'll change the ending tag to motion.span as well. As soon as we save this, let's go ahead and add some styles so that we can see what we're going to do before we actually do it. So we're going to add a transform, and we'll say translate X -15% for this top one, and go ahead and hit save there. And you can see it starts to go to the left. And then for the second one, we're going to have a style of transform translate X, and we're going to push that over by 15% in the positive direction, so that starts to go to the right. So this is essentially what we're going to do with Firmware Motion just by transforming our scroll right progress value. So we'll see how we're going to do that here in 1 second. In order to transform the scroll right progress value, which is a value of 0 to 1, into a value of either 0 to 15 or 0 to -15, let's go ahead and use the transform hook. So I'm going to say use transform, and we're going to track scroll Y progress. And as it goes from 0 to 1, we're going to want to go from, for the top one, 0% to -15%. And let's make sure use transform is imported. Let me go ahead and see if we can just go ahead and hit enter, and it should automatically import that at the top. So we'll call this const transform top. And then we also need a transform bottom that goes to +15. So I'm going to duplicate this and then go ahead and call that one transform bottom, and that is going to go from 0 to +15%, and go ahead and save that. And then we can come down and use those values. So transform top, we can go and replace what's going on here with our transform top. And in fact, we can just go ahead and say X, because this is a motion span, it will take that value, and we can say transform top. And we can do the same thing for our bottom one. We can say X and then say transform bottom, and that should take effect as we scroll. So let's go ahead and try this. Let's go ahead and scroll. And now that we're scrolling, you can see that our words are animating to the left and the right. So as we scroll up, you can see that it's animating over, and as we scroll back down, it's animating the opposite direction. Let's go ahead and see this happen at the tablet and the desktop view as well, because it's probably a little bit of a better animation. So you can see that we're seeing that animation happen over here, and over in our desktop view, we're also seeing it happen over here. So the only thing I don't like about this animation right now is that I think I'd like to reverse it, because I don't ever really see the word sum show up on my screen in totality. So I'd like to probably reverse this and actually change this one to transform bottom and change this one to transform top, so that they're going in opposite directions. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like if we see that animation happen. So let's go ahead and open this up, and you can see that now we can see the full words and including the ending words as well. So it definitely adds, I think, a better effect to this page. Let's see this on the tablet view as well. That's a better effect. And I think even on mobile, just being able to see the entirety of these sentences is a much better effect. So I'm going to leave that as is. I might change the name of my variables though. So I don't like transform top and bottom, or we'll just go ahead and change this out and we'll say that this is still transform top, but we'll go ahead and change the way that it goes. So we're going to say that the transform top goes to 15% and the transform bottom goes to negative 15%. And that'll just go ahead and change the X value of that second span to transform bottom. So that is doing the same thing, but it's just renamed to be a little bit more obvious what's going on. Now that that's working well, let's focus on our testimonials themselves. Now for these testimonials, what we are going to have to do is we're probably going to have to break these out into a separate component in order to be able to use motion the way that we want to be able to use motion for this component. So I'm going to go ahead and code fold my div, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this into a new component. So let's come into our components folder, create a new file, and let's call this testimonial.tsx. And inside of that file, we're going to create a const testimonial. And that's going to take in some props and of course return some JSX. We're going to go ahead and just paste what we had in there before inside of that. And we'll say return and go ahead and give that some parentheses as well. And then we're going to say export default testimonial. And that'll make sure that that React component is able to be exported. Let's go ahead and give our props a type so that TypeScript knows what's going on here. So this props, we're going to take in a quote. So that quote is going to be a string and it's going to be required. As we scroll down, we're also going to take in a name, role, and company. Those are all going to be strings. So name, string, role is also going to be a string, and company is also going to be a string. All those are going to be required. We have an image position Y that's going to be a required number. We also have an image. I'm going to leave that as a string for now, but I'm probably going to change that here in a second. And we also need to import next image because we don't have that in this component yet. So I'm going to come to the top of my file and say import image from next image, and that should align that. And you can see that for the source, we need either a string or a static import. So let's go ahead and change this image to string or static import. And then we need to go ahead and destructure our props so we have all of these variables. So let's come to the top of our file inside of our testimonial and just say const quote name role company image position Y and image are all coming from props. There are a couple of other props that we're going to want to accept now that this is a component. So we're going to also want to accept a class name so that we can add those on if we need to. And we're also going to want to say rest to get our rest props so that we can toss this onto our main parent div. I'm going to take away this key because we're going to do that inside of wherever we're mapping over our testimonial. I also want to make sure that we're accounting for our class name. So I'm going to use TW_merge. I'm going to import TW_merge from Tailwind merge, and then go ahead and use that for our class name. So say TW_merge and go ahead and merge in whatever class name we're pulling in right here. I need to make sure that this class name is in my props. So let's go ahead and give this a class name. That's going to be an optional string. And then for my rest props, I need to be able to tell it that we can also take anything that we can add to a div. So I'm going to say and HTML attributes of an HTML div element. And that should make sure that my rest props are typed. Now it's saying that the value is not read yet, and that's of course correct. So let's go ahead and say ... rest, and that'll make sure that that value is read. So I'm going to go ahead and save this right now. We're not using this component yet, so we're not going to see anything change, but we should at least be able to see what's going on inside of this testimonial. And now we should be able to go ahead back and then use our testimonial inside of our testimonials.tsx. So let's come into our testimonials.tsx. Let's remove the div that we had here. And then we'll say testimonial, and we should be able to import it from @/component/testimonial. And then we just need to be able to add on our props. So we'll say name equals the name, the company is equal to the company, role is equal to role, quote is equal to quote, image is equal to image, and image position Y is equal to image position Y. As we stated when we were removing this, we also need to add key. So we'll say key equals, and we'll just go ahead and add name. We just need a unique string there. So that's what we'll add right there. After we hit save, we once again should not see anything change because none of our JSX at this point has changed. We've used our testimonial, but we copied and pasted what we had inside of there. So now we have this component that we can use to animate this on and off the screen, but we haven't changed too much about the actual structure of the JSX at this point. Now that we have our testimonial component in place, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to animate the presence of each of these testimonials. So when one comes onto the page, we'd like to animate the image onto the page, animate the text onto the page, and then when it goes off, we'll animate it off, then switch over to our next testimonial and animate that onto the page. And actually, Motion React makes this very easy to accomplish with its animate presence component. So let's go ahead and import that into this page. I'm going to come up to the top of my file. We're not using next image anymore, so I'm going to remove that. And we're going to also import animate presence, which is a component we can add around our testimonials. So let's come down to our testimonials and go ahead and add this animate presence component around this. And with that, it will allow us to wait for any exit animations to finish before it switches to the next testimonial on the screen. And we can demonstrate this pretty quickly by switching the current testimonial around. Of course, we do need to save which one is the current testimonial. Right now, we're just leaving this at a static value of 0. But of course, we need to change this to state in order to be able to change between our different testimonials. So I'm going to switch this around to use state. I'm going to say const testimonial index and set testimonial index. And that's going to be equal to use state with a default value of 0. Let's make sure use state is imported. I'm going to write it out again and see if I can just hit enter and import it from React. After that, what we'd like to happen is for our arrows to be able to change this testimonial index. So I'm going to come down to my arrows, and on my buttons, I'm going to put some on-click handlers. So I'm going to say on-click equals handle click prev. And then for my second one, I haven't created this function yet, but I'm going to say on-click equals handle click next. And that should allow us to create those click handlers. Up in the top of our file, let's go ahead and create those click handlers. So say const handle click prev. And that's going to be equal to a function that's going to set the testimonial index based on the current value. So if the current value is equal to 0, of course, we're going to want to go to the last testimonial. So we'll say return testimonials.length -1. Otherwise, we'll just return cur -1. And that should handle the clicking of our previous button. And it's saying handle click next is not defined. Of course, we haven't defined that yet. We're about to do that. So I'm going to say const handle click next is equal to a function as well. And we're going to, in this case, set the testimonial index based on the current value. And we'll say if the current value is equal to testimonials.length -1, we're going to return 0. Otherwise, we're going to return cur +1. And that should allow us to both click to our next testimonial and our previous testimonial. So let's go ahead and scroll down now to our testimonials and see if we can now toggle through our different testimonials. So we've got our one there, we have another one here, and we have another one here. Now, the reason we're seeing that little bit of a jump is due to our animate presence. Our animate presence needs to wait for anything to happen before it animates the next one in. So we're going to say mode equals wait, and that should ensure that we're only showing one at a time. Let me go ahead and hit save and see if now we see a little bit of a smoother transition between those. I'm going to hit over. And yeah, now we're just transforming between each one, but we're waiting for the other one to disappear from the page before replacing it with our new testimonial. That is a helpful little prop there. While we're at it, we also want to say initial equals false. And all this is going to do is make sure that our first one does not transition onto the page, but all the other ones do. So we're not waiting for our first initial animation to happen before we show that testimonial. We're just going ahead and showing it as is. So now that we have everything set up inside of our testimonials section, let's come into our individual testimonial and talk about what we're going to need to do in order to animate this onto the page. Of course, the main thing we want to do is make sure that both the quote and the citation are able to be animated similarly to how we've animated everything else as far as our text. So we want to make sure that it's split type. We want to make sure that it animates with that staggered delay. And then when it exits, we want to make sure that it exits consistently as well. So let's go ahead and see if we can add some of those. We need to go ahead and import split type, of course. So I'm going to import split type from split type. And then we also want to use animate. So I'm going to import use animate from motion/react so that we can hook up our animations to the different quotes on the page. So after that, let's go into the top of our testimonial and say const quote scope quote animate is equal to use animate. And then we'll also say const site scope site animate is equal to use animate. We also want to make sure that the words are hidden by default. So we're going to do that with use effect. So I'm going to say use effect. And that, of course, is going to be a function that runs whenever this component mounts. And we're going to say new split type like we've done before. We're going to take in our quote scope.current, and we're going to say that the types is equal to lines and words, and that the tag name is span. And then let me come down into my block quote and go ahead and find what we want to actually hook that up to. So I think that's going to be this div right here. Let's see if that'll work. I'm going to say ref equals quote scope, and then hopefully that should hook up that scope and allow that type to be split. And let me go ahead and save that and see if that pulls that away. So it looks like split type doesn't like when we have a span tag that wraps our quote. And I think that's specifically because it's looking for words that are direct children of this ref. So let me go ahead and try and take this span tag off and see what happens. Let me go ahead and hit end span and go ahead and save this one more time. The page is going to reload, so we need to scroll back down to our quotes and see if this quote is hidden. If the quote is hidden, I think that means we've done a good job of going ahead and splitting our type. I also want to see what happens if we go from testimonial to testimonial, because we're hoping not to see a flash of quotes show up on the screen. So we see that one is not showing up, and we also see the next one is not showing up. So I think having that split type initialized right away is helping our quote to be hidden by default, which is working well. Now that we've done this text animation a few times, it seems like it would be better to go ahead and relegate this to a custom hook rather than writing this over and over again, where we're splitting our type, we're animating, we're hooking up our scope, we're doing all of that, and we're creating a custom animation. If we ever need to shift this animation, slow it down, speed it up, whatever it is, we're going to have to do this in multiple places. And that's exactly the kind of thing we want to avoid. So actually, let's go ahead and create a custom hook for this text reveal animation. So we're going to go ahead into our hooks folder and go ahead and create a new file called use text reveal animation.ts. Inside of that, let's go ahead and create a function. So I'm going to say const use text reveal animation is equal to a function that is going to, for now, return null. And then we're going to say export default use text reveal animation. Now this is going to be a custom hook. So the first thing we're going to do inside of this hook is go ahead and set up our split type. So let's go ahead and run a use effect. And inside of that use effect, let's go ahead and create a new split type. And for the split type, we need a target element. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to import use animate into this custom hook, and then we'll export that scope in order to allow the user of this custom hook to hook this up. So we'll say const scope and animate is equal to use animate from motion/react. And then the new split type is going to have scope.current. And it is going to also take in some options. So we're going to say types, lines, and words. And we're also going to say tag name is going to be equal to span. So this is normally what we would do inside of these other use effects. Of course, we only want this to run the first time. And we also need to make sure that we have everything in here, any of the dependencies. So it looks like scope is a dependency of that use effect. So we'll go ahead and make sure that that is in place as well. After that, let's go ahead and return the scope to the user of this custom hook. So we'll say return, and we'll go ahead and give that some curly brackets and say scope. We're also going to want to return the ability to run an entrance animation. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const entrance is equal to a function that's going to return the running of the animate function. Now this animate function is going to take in the target. So we'll say that the target is, in this case, is going to be scope.current.query selector all.words. So we can get all of the words inside of that scope. And then we're going to run our transform. So we're going to say transform translate y to 0. And we're going to do it with the same duration and delay that we've been using. So we're going to say duration 0.5. Delay is going to be equal to stagger from motion/react 0.2. And then that function is what we're going to also return alongside our scope. So we're going to say entrance, and in fact, we'll just rename this to entrance animation, and then we'll export it as well as entrance animation and go ahead and hit save. So after we've done all that, let's go ahead and use this custom hook. So let's come back into our testimonial. And now that we have this custom hook, we can remove this use effect, and we can also remove this animation up here. So I'm going to remove, or at least comment out this quote animation. And then I'm going to use my custom hook. I'm going to say const scope is equal to use text reveal animation. And then I'm going to rename this to quote scope. And that should allow me to use that quote scope inside of this animation. And of course, will also give me an entrance animation that I can use. I'm going to rename this to quote animate. So essentially, I've just replaced what we had with this use animate function as well as everything else we were doing. Now we have this animation function that I can run whenever I'm ready to reveal our animated text. So let's make sure this quote scope is still hooked up correctly. Let's go down to our quote. We can see that we still have this quote scope here. So let's go ahead and save this page and see if our text is still hidden over in our browser. So after I run this, you can see that it does hide my text. And if I go over to the next one, you can see that that text is hidden as well. And in the next one, that text is hidden as well. So that looks like it's working correctly. Now let's see if we can actually animate it in. So let's go ahead and run a use effect inside of our testimonial itself. And we're going to run this when this loads. And we're going to say quote animate as a function and just go ahead and hit save. After that, you can see we have a quote animation that works, but now we also want to run our citation animation as well. So let's try and hook that up by using another use text reveal animation. So I'm going to add another one. I'm going to say const scope, and this is going to be cite scope. Just going to rename that. And then I'm going to rename entrance animation to cite animate. And I'm going to make that equal to my custom hook name, use text reveal animation as well. And I'm going to comment out my other use animate so we don't have duplicates of the same variable. After I've done that, let's go ahead and hook up our cite scope. So I'm going to come down to my citation and go ahead and give this a ref of cite scope. And that should hook that up. And that will allow us to run our citation animation. So in the same use effect, I'm just going to run cite animate and just make sure that this works before we modify this to actually make it look correct. So after I save that, let me go ahead and refresh my page and see if we have both of these animating in. And we do. You can see that both of those are now animating in, which is good news. But what we want is for the quote to first animate in and then to have the citation animate in after it. And since this animation is a promise, we can easily say .then and then run something afterwards after it completes. So we'll say .then and then go ahead and run our citation animation just by putting it in that .then. So let me go ahead and save that and let's see if that works when we refresh our page. So you can see that that's working really well. I'm really happy with how that's working. We can actually speed that up or slow that down across the entire site if we use this custom hook and we change any of these durations, delays, whatever it is. I think I might speed this up just a little bit by saying 0.15 instead of 0.2 and go ahead back to my testimonial, go ahead and hit refresh. And that should apply both to my quote itself and to the citation below it. After that, I'm happy with where that's at. But of course, we don't just want to animate our entrance, we also want to animate our exit. So in order to do that, what we can do is we can use presence from motion/react. So I'm going to import use presence from motion, and I'm also going to remove use animate because I'm not using that anymore, as well as removing split type because we're no longer using that. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to bring in use presence in place of my commented code. So I'm going to say use presence. And then that gives us a couple of variables that we can use. So we can say const is present and also safe to remove is equal to that use presence hook. So these are two variables that gives us. This one is present will be true when this animates onto the screen. And then we can also animate our component off the screen and then call safe to remove. And then inside of our testimonials, animate presence will know that that component is safe to remove from the screen. So let's see if this actually works. What we're going to do is we're going to say that if is present is equal to true. Then we're going to run our entrance animations, which is going to be quote and site animate. And we should probably rename these. We should probably rename this as quote entrance animation or something like that. And then site entrance animation. That will help us to understand what's going on. So quote entrance animation, and then we'll rename that to site entrance animation. So basically the quote entrance animation runs first, and then the citation animation runs after that. Otherwise, if it's not present, we should probably go ahead and animate these quotes off of the page. We can do that using the same custom use text reveal animation. So if we go back to our custom text reveal animation, we can also create an exit animation. So I'm going to say const exit animation is equal to, and then we need to define what we want to happen when this exits the page. In this case, we're going to return the same animate function. We're going to return the same scope.current.query selector all.word to select all the words inside. And what we're going to do is we're going to transform, in this case, translate y 100%. So we're basically taking all of those words and telling them to go ahead and translate back to 100%. And then we need to set some transition options on this as well. So we're going to say duration, and this is going to be a little bit faster. It's going to happen in 0.3 seconds. And then the delay is going to be a little bit different as well because we're going to stagger it backwards. So we'll say stagger negative 0.025, and we'll also set a start delay. And the start delay is going to be equal to whatever the current length of those words is times 0.025. So essentially we're just calculating out how many of those negative staggers we can use. So we'll say start delay is going to be equal to scope.current.query selector all.word.length times 0.025. And that will be our exit animation. It's basically going to be a reversal that's going to allow us to animate that text off of the screen. So we're going to return as part of this custom hook, our exit animation out of it as well to allow the user of this custom hook to use that. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and come back into my testimonial and see if we can make that work. So what we're going to do is we're going to call if it's not present. So this is in the else statement. We're going to call exit animation, but we need to go ahead and import that first from our use text reveal. So we'll say exit animation on our quote, and that's going to be equal to quote exit animation. And then we just need to call this in our else statement. So quote exit animation. And then we'll say dot then, and we'll run a function that says safe to remove. So essentially after that exit animation happens, we're saying that it is safe to remove. Now I know we still have to run our citation exit animation as well, but let's at least see if this works before we go any further. And as I click this, I'm not seeing it change. And I think that's because we haven't told our use effect to watch the is present variable. So let's go ahead and tell it to watch that is present variable so that this will run every time is present changes. So I'm gonna go ahead and save that again, and we can see if that will work now. And once we do that, if we click this, you can see that we at least get an exit animation of our quote before it snaps over to the next testimonial, which means we also need to go ahead and have an exit animation for our citation, and we need to figure out how we want to animate our photos. So we're going to do all of that. Let's go ahead and first implement the exit animation for our citation. So I'm going to say exit animation and just rename this as site exit animation. And then we can basically run a promise.all on this quote exit animation. So I can say promise.all and then run both quote exit animation as well as site exit animation. and then say .then, and then go ahead and run the function that says save to remove. So that should make sure that both of those are done first. Those are going to run at the same time, and then it should go ahead and remove it and put our next testimonial on the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and see if that works. So we see that this testimonial is animating onto the page. Once we click this, it will exit both of them, and then it will show us our next testimonial. And if I click that again, it's going to exit first and then show us our next testimonial. That's a really nice effect, but of course we still need to go ahead and make sure that our testimonial image has an exit animation as well. To implement that, let's go ahead and import motion into our component. So I'm going to import motion, and we're just going to add a div to go ahead and cover our image when it's shifting and then uncover it after it switches to the next testimonial. So you'll see what I'm talking about here in a second. This is going to be next to our image right here. So let's go ahead and stick a motion.div right above our image, and then we can go ahead and give it some props to tell it what to do. So in this case, we're going to give it a class name of absolute. It's going to be the full height of the image, so I'm going to say h full. It's also going to have a background color of stone 900, so I'm going to say bg stone 900 to give it that dark color. And then we're going to control the width based on what our testimonial is doing. So initially, the width is going to be 100%. Then after it animates in, the width is going to be 0. And then when it exits, the width is going to be, once again, 100%. And we're also going to control the transition by giving it a transition prop, and that transition is going to be happening over a duration of half a second. So that's at 0.5. So let's see if that works by going ahead and clicking over to our next testimonial. I'm going to hit this button, and yes, it works, but it's not being constrained to the right container. So let me go ahead and constrain it to this aspect square container by giving this a relative class, and then going ahead and hitting save again. And then we can see if it works by going to our next testimonial. And now you can see that our image is being covered up before we transition to our next testimonial, and then it's being uncovered once our testimonial is animating into the page. That's actually a really cool effect. Let's see that on a bigger screen by going ahead and pulling out our browser and looking at our tablet view first. So in this tablet view, let's go ahead and go to the next testimonial. And you can see that that's a great effect. You're able to see the text animate on and off the page. And the same thing is true once it goes to the next one. You're getting that amazing effect of having that text animate as well as those images. So that looks really, really nice. And before we go any further, let's go ahead and look at this on desktop just to make sure that everything looks good there as well. Let's go ahead and click over and see this animation happen at this screen size as well. I really like where this is at. There's a couple of things we need to take care of before we move on though. One of these is we want these buttons to change color as we hover over them. So let's go ahead and modify that. And we're also going to take our use text reveal animation and make sure it's implemented in our other components as well, so that we're using that same hook in our other components. We also want to make sure that this is cleaned up. It says there's a couple of dependencies missing. These aren't going to be any problem to go ahead and add. So I'm going to add all of those. So it's going to be quote entrance animation, the site entrance animation, the quote exit animation, the site exit animation, and then we also need to add safe to remove. All of those functions are functions that we're using inside of useEffect, but since those functions don't change, they aren't going to affect when that useEffect runs. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save, but that shouldn't change anything about the way that our application currently works. Let's go back to our testimonials so we can modify those buttons and scroll down to those buttons. These are going to be these ones right here that are holding our SVGs. So we're going to say when these buttons are hovered, we're going to change the background to red, orange 500. We're also going to change the text to white. And we also want the border to change to that same red, orange 500. So I'm going to say hover border red, orange 500. And we want this to happen with a transition, of course. So we're going to say transition all and duration 300 to make it happen fairly quickly. If that works on our previous button, we'll just go ahead and implement the same thing on our next button. That's looking good to me. So I'm just going to copy and paste what we have here and paste it onto our second button so that we have the same effect going on there. And if I go ahead and hit save and hover over both of those buttons, we can now see that we have a nice little effect when we hover those. Last but not least, let's go ahead into our intro and see if we can implement the same use text reveal animation hook. So I'm going to see if I can do that by importing use text reveal animation from my @/hooks /use text reveal animation. And I'm just going to go ahead and comment out all the things that I've done in order to make that work in this particular function. So we have several things, use effect there. We are going to want to keep in view and run our animation when that happens. But everything else, I think we can comment out. So I'm going to comment out all of those. And then I'm going to go ahead and say const scope and then entrance animation is equal to use text reveal animation. And then I'm going to add a use effect. That use effect is going to run when in view changes. And of course, when in view changes is when we want to run our entrance animation. So I'm going to say if in view entrance animation. And let's see, we also need to include our entrance animation function there. So I'm gonna go ahead and save this and see if that still works. I'm gonna go ahead and refresh my page and scroll up to my entrance animation here. Let me refresh my page one more time and take a look. And it looks like the reason that that's not working is because before we were using our in-view scope for the same thing we were using our text reveal animation scope for. And so now we need to kind of split those out and say that the in-view scope is going to be our section, but our text reveal animation is going to have a different scope. So let's go ahead and change this. Let's go ahead and give this a ref. So I'm going to say const section ref is equal to use ref from React. I'm going to take my section ref and replace my current scope with my section ref. That section ref will probably have to have some TypeScript updates. So we'll need to say null, and we'll also need to say HTML element, and go ahead and save that. And then for our H2, that's where we'll say ref equals scope from our animation scope. So let's go ahead and save that and see if that works any better. I'm going to pull this back over, go ahead and refresh my page and see if this now looks a little bit different. And now you can see that that works a lot better now that we split those two apart, because our animation needed to know exactly what element it was going to be working on. Since those were two different elements that we needed to be watching, we just needed to split those up a little bit. So I can get rid of all my other code now that I wrote. So I can get rid of this use animate here. I can get rid of both of the use effects that we wrote down here. And we can also get rid of a few dependencies from this particular file. So we can get rid of that split type, as well as my stagger and use animate up in Motion React, and go ahead and hit save. And that should still work exactly the same. The same thing can also be true for our hero, which we know is currently using that same text animation. So I'm going to come into our hero and see what we can change for this. Here, right here is where we've done our split type and our text animation. So let's go ahead and comment that out. And we also want to see if there's anything else we did. It looks like title scope. We want to comment that out as well. And then we also want to make sure that we import our use text reveal animation. So I'm going to say const scope equals use text reveal animation. And of course we want our entrance animation from there as well. And then we'll just give it a simple use effect. And we'll say that when this renders, we'll go ahead and say entrance animation. And we want to hook up this scope as well. So let's find the scope for that. That's going to be right here, this motion div. We're going to change the ref of that to scope. We're going to say entrance animation here as a dependency, and then everything else I think should work as is. Let me go ahead and save this and see if our hero will animate as well over on our desktop site. So coming back all the way back up, let's go ahead and reload the page and see if our words animate in, and it looks like they do. Still works very well, so I'm happy with where that's at. Let's go ahead and come into our code and remove our commented code that we refactored. We'll remove our use animate hook that we refactored out. We're also going to remove any dependencies that we no longer need. So we're removing those, as well as split type, and even this ESLint disable next line. We don't need that anymore because we now have our hero image being used. So all of that looks like it's working very well. I'm very happy with where that's at. With that, we're ready for animating the next section of the page. Now that we're done with our testimonial animations, let's move down into our FAQs. Let's open up our FAQs section and see what animations we're going to want to create inside of this section. So right now, none of our FAQs have any sort of hover effects, and they also don't allow us to click on an FAQ and see the answer. So we want to change both of those things and also create a great animated effect. So that's what we're going to do inside of this section. The first thing I'd like to do is at least go ahead and see an answer when we click on a question. In order for us to do that, we do need to go ahead and have some sort of way to save the selected index of the question that we have selected. So in order to do that, we're going to use state. So I'm going to say const selected index and also set selected index. It's going to be equal to use state. And by default, that is going to be null. Now we're going to need to tell TypeScript that this could be a couple of different values. So this can either be a number or it can be null. Both of those are valid. Let me go ahead and import use state from React just by going ahead and reinitiating that. And then we should have our selected index and of course the ability to set our selected index as well. Now the thing that's going to allow us to select a specific question is of course clicking on that question. That's going to be one of these divs right here. So for each of these divs, we're going to add an on-click handler. That on-click handler is going to run an inline function, and it is going to allow us to set that selected index. Now, we don't know what that index is yet because we've mapped over these FAQs, but we have not yet pulled out the index. So we should probably do that. Let's go ahead and pull out FAQ index, and then we can say set selected index to FAQ index. We can make this a little bit more complex though if we want to by basically saying if the selected index is already selected, then just go ahead and set it to null. So I'm going to actually do that right now. I'm going to go ahead and make this an inline function and say if FAQ index equals selected index, then set selected index to null. And I'll just say else, and that's when we'll set our selected index to our FAQ index. And let's end that with one more bracket so that that's all within that same function, and go ahead and hit save. Now we have use state on the page. I just hit save, which means it's going to give us that error about the client component. So I'm going to come to the top of this FAQs.tsx and say use client to make sure we are using a client component for that. After that, we'd like to be able to see our answer if that particular question is selected. So that's going to be below this div right here. I'm going to go ahead and fold that question div up so we can put an answer div below it. So I'm going to say div, and then inside that, we're going to have a paragraph that's going to contain the answer that we're getting from our mapped value. And then we're just going to end that with another div. That paragraph is going to have a class name of TextXL and MT4 to give it 16 pixels of margin above it to space it out from the question. Of course, we only want to see that if the FAQ index is equal to the selected index. So I'll say FAQ index equals selected index and then we can go ahead and show that div in that case. So only if it's the selected one do we want to see that FAQ. So let's go ahead and click one of these and we can see that we now see the selected FAQ answer. So we see each of these answers for these. That's good, but of course we want to animate that. And the way that we can do that is with the same animate presence that we've already used. So let me come up to the top of my file and we'll import animate presence from motion/react, and then we can put it around this FAQ index equals check. So I'm going to say animate presence here and put my ending one after that check so that when this animates, we can actually animate onto the page if it's a motion.div. So we're also going to switch this over to a motion.div, but I'll also need to import that. So at the top of my file, I'll go ahead and import motion, and then inside of that animate presence, we're going to switch this to a motion.div. And the same thing for the ending div, we'll say ending motion.div. And that will allow us to have some control over how we can animate that onto the page. So what we'll do is for that div, we'll go ahead and give it an initial value of height 0. Then we'll say when it animates onto the page, we want that to have height of auto. So it'll animate between 0 and auto. And then when it exits, we'll also want it to have another height of 0. We'll also control the transition with a transition prop. So we'll say that the duration is going to be equal to 0.7 seconds and that the easing is going to be ease out. And that will make a nice easing effect when that enters and exits the page. The only other thing we want to do is make sure that as this height is animating that the overflow is hidden. So it's hiding our paragraph if it gets too small. So we're also going to add a class name to this and we're going to say overflow hidden. And that should ensure that the overflow is going to be hidden as this animates up and down. Now that we've done that, let's see if that works. So I'm going to click into one of my FAQs and you can see that that animates in. Click into another one that animates in as well. and click into another one that animates nicely as well. So those are looking really good, but now we need to do a couple more things to just go ahead and add another level of polish to these FAQs. One of the things we'd like to do is go ahead and turn our crosses or plus signs, if it's an FAQ, 45 degrees to make it look like an X if that FAQ is selected. So let's go in and see how we can make that happen. This div right here is the one that's around our SVG. What we'd like to do is basically say, if this is a selected index, let's go ahead and add a rotation to that div. So we can do that with TW merge. So I'll say TW merge and then go ahead and add that around my entire class name. Let's go ahead and make sure that's imported. So I'll use that again and hit enter. So that should import it from the top of my file. And then we can say FAQ index is equal to the selected index and then go ahead and add some additional classes if it's selected. And that's just going to be rotate 45 is the only class that we'll add there. We're also going to want to add a transition though. So we'll say transition and duration 500 to the base classes so that when it transitions with that rotation, we actually see that happen. So let me go ahead and save that and test this to see if it works. I'm going to click on another one here and you can see that it does rotate over. Click on one here, you can see it rotates over, and as soon as it goes to another question, it rotates back. So that's a nice effect as well for that. It's a little bit slow for my taste. I want to see if I can just speed that up a little bit. Let's go to duration 300 and see if that looks any better. So I'm going to go ahead and click this one. You can see that, yes, it does immediately rotate over. I think I like that a little bit better, so I'm going to leave that there. The only other thing we're going to do at the mobile size is to make the same thing that we saw in our projects, where you have this little sheet that comes up behind the project to just give it another level of polish. That same sheet is going to come up behind our FAQ as we hover over those. So let's go ahead and figure out how to add those in as well. That sheet should be absolutely positioned behind each question or inside of each question. So let's go ahead and add a div to the top of our questions. And let's go ahead and say ending div here as well. And we'll give this a class name of absolute. We'll make sure that the height is 0, that the width is full, and the background color is stone 300. And of course, we want this to be inside a relative container. So I'll make sure that my question is a relative container. And I also want to make sure that my content sits above it. So I'm also going to make this, and I also want to make sure my content sits above it. So I'm going to isolate this question and then give this a negative Z index of 10 and see if that still shows up. Of course, we'll want to make sure that when the question is hovered is when this animation happens. So we'll add a group /FAQ, and then we'll say down in our absolute position div that when the group FAQ is hovered, we'll go ahead and say H full to give it that full height. We also want to make sure it's in the right position. So I want to make sure that it says bottom 0 and left 0, and go ahead and hit save, and then we'll see if this works. So it looks like it works, but we're not seeing any kind of transition at this point. So we want to add that in. So we'll say transition all duration 700 to make that a slow duration. And then let's take one more look and see if it works now. So you can see that it definitely works. There's a couple of things that we're going to change though. Number one, we want to make sure that our plus icon or our X icon stays the same color as the background of the page. So we'll go inside of that div and say BG stone 200. We also want to make sure that if there is an FAQ open, that it's going to continue to show that background all the time. So we're going to also come up to our absolute position div and say TW merge on this. So TW merge, and go ahead and surround our class name. And then we'll say that if the FAQ index is equal to the selected index, that it's automatically going to have a height of full, and go ahead and hit save on that. So now when we hover over another one, we can still see that animation happen, but if there's an open one, it's automatically going to be hovered. And then when we close that, then it's not going to be automatically behind any of these FAQs. Now this looks really good. I really like how it looks on mobile. Let's see how it looks on our tablet view. As I scroll down, you can see that this still looks really good, I think, over on tablets. So let me go ahead and click into one of these, and you still see a nice answer showing up for any of these FAQs. That looks really nice. I would like to add a little bit more padding to the left and right on desktop though. So let's go ahead and see if we can just add a little bit more of a padding effect when one of these FAQs opens up. In order to do that, our div that flexes our question just needs a TW-merge function as well. So I'm going to say TW-merge and then go ahead and add in a FAQ index equals a selected index and large px8 should add 32 pixels of padding on the left and right to that question if it is selected. So let's go ahead and see how we can, if we can see that happen by going ahead and clicking on one. And we do, but there's no transition. So we'd also like to add a little bit of a transition. So I'm going to say transition all duration 700 as well, and go ahead and hit save and pull this back out and take another look. So let's go ahead and click on one of these. And now it's a really nice transition when we open up one of our FAQs. However, our answer isn't coming in like our question is. And that's a little bit of a problem. So we'd like to fix that as well. In order to do that, all we need to do is come down and do the same thing to our animate presence motion div. So inside of that div, inside of that class name, we can say large px8, and that should ensure it has the same 32 pixels of padding to the left and right for our answer as well. So let me go ahead and pull this back out. Take one more look at this. So this looks nice. I like where it's at, but I think I would still like for the hover to also push in my question left and right as well. So let's see if we can make that happen. I think that'll be the last thing that we do in here. So where we've put our large px8, we'd also probably like to have a hover here as well. So let's go ahead and say hover large px8, and that should hopefully ensure that even a hover effect on our desktop will make that. And it looks like we don't need a hover large px8. We need to track when the FAQ is hovered. So we need to say group hover /FAQ, and then we can say large px8, and that should take care of it. But let's just double check by going ahead and hovering over our FAQs. And that's a really nice effect. Let me go ahead and pull my browser out all the way so we can take a good look at this effect. So when I hover over this, you can see that each FAQ animates over, and then when we open it up, then it has that nice background. It rotates our plus into a close button, and we see our answer animate onto the page. And of course, when it goes away, it animates off. So it's just a really smooth effect that we've added to these FAQs. They look really, really nice. And of course, if we click one, then we can make all of the answers go away as well. So that is a really great effect we've added here. I like how it turned out. Now it's time for us to look at our footer. Now that our FAQs animations are taken care of, let's go ahead down to our footer and see what we need to do down here. Since we've already created our text button animations, we should already see these underlines happening. And of course, for our button itself, we already see that the background is changing as we hover, but we still do need to flip that icon like we did with our other ones. We also want to animate this text in, but of course we have a helper for that now. And we want to make this green dot pulse. So those three things should take care of our footer. So let's go ahead into our footer and see how we can make those changes. Coming down into our sections, let's open up our footer.tsx. We know that this is going to turn into a client component as soon as we bring in our text animation. So let's go ahead and give it the use client directive. And we also know that we want to import our text animation. So we're going to use text reveal animation, and we know that that's going to give us a scope and an entrance animation for us to run. We're going to tie that scope to the text that says enough talk. So that's going to be this H2 right here. It doesn't like that I've used this apostrophe without an HTML entity. So let me go ahead and switch that around real quick. So that's and APOS semicolon. And then we're going to tie our scope into a ref on our H2. So I'm going to say ref equals scope to tie that to our text reveal animation. And then we want to animate this in when it's in view. So we'll also need to use in view. So I'm going to say const in view is equal to use in view from motion/react. We also need to give in view our scope so it knows what to watch. And then we need to run a use effect that looks at that in view value. And we need to make sure that's imported from React. So I'm going to say use effect again and hit enter to import that from React. And then we're going to run our entrance animation if it's in view. So I'm going to say if in view entrance animation and just go ahead and run that function. I also need to make this part of my dependency array. So I'm going to say entrance animation here as well and go ahead and hit save. And we should be able to see that entrance animation work at that point. That was super easy to do because we had this custom hook set up already. So that was all it took for us to create our text entrance animation. It's also going to be super easy for us with Tailwind to go ahead and pulse this rounded full div here. So I just need to say animate pulse, and that should add that pulse animation. Let's go ahead and hit save. And now you can see that we have this dimming of that, and it just kind of gives it a little bit of a different eye-catching feel to it. Now that those two animations are knocked out that quickly, it's time for us to come down to our button and see if we can go ahead and flip that icon from left to right. Now we know that in order to do this, what we need to do is add a div. At this point, I probably should have created a component, but now that we're down in the footer, I think that usefulness might be lost on us. So let me go ahead and create two divs. We know that we're going to surround this SVG with two different divs. Those two different divs are going to be sized based on our SVG. So this is size 6. So we need to make the outer div with a class name of size 6. The inner div, we need to make a class name of width 12 and h6. And then we also need to flex it. And then we need two SVGs. So let me go ahead and add both of these SVGs in here and go ahead and hit save. Now we should see those two SVGs showing up here. But of course, if we hide the overflow of our size 6 using overflow hidden, then we should just see the one SVG. And then all we need to add in is a rule on our inner flexed div that says that when our group is hovered with the hover group of button, then we should do a negative translate x 1/2. And I believe that should be all it takes. Let's go ahead and try this out. Let me go ahead and hover over this. And it could be working, it could not be, but since we haven't added a transition, there's no way for us to really tell if it's working or not. So we just need to also add a little bit of a transition here. So I'm going to say transition transform because that's what we're going to be transitioning. And then I'm also going to say duration, let's just say 500. And go ahead and hit save and see if this works. So I'm going to go ahead back over here, hover this, and now we do see that it works. I'd like to speed this up just a little bit. I'm going to make this a duration of 300. Go ahead and hit save again, and let's see if we see a nice quick transition here. And indeed we do. I like where that transition's at. So everything that we wanted to do in the footer, we've accomplished in about 5 minutes. We added a pulsing animation to our one spot available for next month. We added the text animation in view, and we also added a little bit of an animation to our button, and we already had the animations for this available to us that were already added in. So everything in this page now is animated. Each individual section is animated on this page, and it looks absolutely amazing. The last thing I wanted to make sure of is that we have our footer nav items linked up. So let's come back down to our nav items and make sure all these are linked up as well. So we know that projects is going to be to hash projects. We know testimonials is going to go to an ID of testimonials. So I'll just go ahead and put that in there. FAQs, and of course we have contact going to our footer, which still has an ID of contact. The only one that doesn't have anything is this home. Let's see what else is in here. So we have about in our nav items in our mobile nav. So I'm just going to change the top one to about. Let's go ahead to about here and about here, and then go ahead and hit save. And then for each of those nav items, we just need to go ahead and handle those clicks. So we have this nav, and then we have this ahref. We're going to say on click equals handle click nav item. And then we're going to define that function up in our component. So let's say const handle click nav item. And that's going to be equal to what we already wrote for our header with a couple of modifications. So let's go ahead and just copy and paste what we have up here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit paste there. We are going to take off set is open false because that's not going to be the case anymore. And we do want to run this with an HTML anchor element. Not sure why we can't do that right offhand. But let me go ahead and hit save and see if we can use this same TypeScript type. And what we need to do is make sure that this is the React type, not the default browser type. So I need to come inside of React and import also mouse event. And after I hit save, that fixes that TypeScript error and allows us to run this code as well. So let's try this out by going to projects. You can see that that works well. Let me go to one more of those links just to make sure all this is working. Going to go to FAQs, and that works as well. With this entire page has been animated from top to bottom, and it looks incredible. So let's go ahead back to the top, go ahead and hit refresh and take a look at this page as we scroll through. So you can see that we have this beautiful text animation along with these button animations where we're getting all that to work. Our mobile navigation works really well where you're seeing all that come into play. We can close that out, scroll down, and you're seeing that portrait come to full width before we go into our text animation. That works really well. Coming down to our selected works, you can see that we have each of our portfolio items animating beautifully onto the page. Same thing is true for our testimonials. Those animate over really well. And coming down to our FAQs, of course, all of those are animated really well, along with our footer that has that great in-view animation. So this is a next level minimal portfolio. I hope you enjoyed doing this project with me, and I'll see you in the next video.